Chapter 381. Chapter 1. Contemplation. Why are we here? Just to suffer. Every moment I can feel the bow pops. Scorch pops onto my shoulder with an annoyed squeak. It has been an hour. I swear if I am forced to continue listening to your inner monologue for 1 second longer, I will blow myself the fuck up. Before I can respond that he does that anyway, he narrows his eyes. In your library. All right, fine, I sigh dramatically, taking a long pull from my cigar as I leaned back into my gloriously overpriced armchair. I will stop amusing myself and wallow in my own misery in silence. Right. He does not believe me for a second. Where is Miss Bonebreaker anyway? A clipped bout of laughter that most assuredly did not sound broken to my ears leaves me unbidden. Victory was mine. I smile a bit too widely before looking away. But at what cost? All right, seriously. Before Scorch can go on another perfectly justified tirade, the door to my personal study is opened by a tired yet happy-looking Davos whose eyes light up the moment he sees me, before his entire expression shifts into a mix of horror and amusement a moment later. Boss? He speaks hesitantly. Are you? I am perfectly all right, Davos. Thank you for asking. I cut him off quickly, definitely not seeing him wince at how hoarse my voice was. Something happened. He blinks his current distraction away and speaks up. Right, Nightshade gave birth while you were busy. We wanted to introduce the kid to you as you requested, but... He pauses and shrugs, pointing at my exhausted-looking self. Shame I missed that. I grumble internally and get up. Holding back a light wince, I sent another burst of restoration into my bones and began walking. Lead the way, then. Getting introduced to little Varador was like a balm to my weary soul. The kid was practically brimming with magic and seemed to have been blessed by both Ariel and Mephala at apparently no cost whatsoever. For a moment I pondered pointing this fuckery out, but I found it best I left the kid to grow up normally and not with priests looking for him every waking day of his life. Nightshade also seemed to suspect something was afoot, with just how powerful he was at less than a day old. But it would seem motherhood had mellowed some of her more hardline views out, and she said nothing. Davos, bless him, was as always utterly ignorant about things above his proverbial pay grade, which was not many things now that I thought about it, with him being the blessed follower of a Daedra and all that. Unlike before, the two of them did not attempt to hide their affection behind the veil of professionalism, and soon I started feeling like I was intruding. So I gave them my congratulations, promised to teach the kid personally, should he will it, and reiterated my not-quite command for them to hold a wedding as soon as reasonable as a bit of neat propaganda. Davos looked just about ready to protest, but one look from his intended had him shutting up and nodding along. I'd have made a joke about whippings, but honestly with the quite literally bone-deep soreness my entire body was racked in, I found it best not to provoke Murphy on that one. My next destination was the Great Hall, quite miffed to find that my numerous servants had been ran completely ragged, catering to everyone before they too succumbed to the atmosphere and ended up just as drunk as the guests, leaving only a trio of them coherent to give me a report. I would forgive it just this once. Potential layoffs aside, no one died during the celebrations, which was an achievement and a half believe you me, considering most of the guests were armed and the rest were the weapons themselves. That there were only 12 close cases where a healer needed to be called in was a bloody miracle sent down to us by Talos himself. Hearing about Torrig's fate, however, made me cackle for a minute straight, frightening servants and waking guests up as I strolled to the peak of my tower. By the time I had finally reached my lounge, all of my soreness was gone, and I was feeling completely renewed. So much so that I was almost tempted to go back and see if I could distract myself for a bit longer, before having to actually consider things. Say what you will about getting your bones nearly broken for a quick tumble, I personally would not have it any other way. Snorting to myself, I shook my head and leaned back so I could stare at the lightly clouded skies. That was enough distractions for now. Within a moment, I was once more deep in my memories. Back in Sovngarde, after I had chugged down a totally not suspicious drop of blood. The possessed suit of armor, who I quickly realized was straight up an aspect of Shaw himself, stopped moving completely. Its purpose fulfilled, it turned into yet another suit of ornamental armor near the nearby wall. But I was too distracted to focus on something like that, as a few seconds after I had imbibed the divine vitae, I felt my own blood begin to boil with power. My bones half snapped before realigning themselves. My eyes lost their light for a moment before returning with a sight sharper than ever before. My mind began moving at indescribable speeds, and my very soul felt just that little bit bigger. Such was the surge of power that for a moment I lost control of myself, and my magicka and divinity both burst from within for just a split second, and nearly toppled a third of the Hall of Valor, only my rapid mind and honed control enabling me to pull it all back in without blowing the hall nor myself up into tiny bits. The feeling of absolute power and growth subsided after a while, but now each breath I took felt like nothing I experienced before. I felt as if I had become something more, something greater than I was previously, with only a singular barrier remaining before I could realize exactly what. A barrier that had something to do with my blood, my mind supplied without prompting. That would have to wait though, I noted as I heard Isgramor give his speech and saw every single bloody hero of Sovngarde begin marching after Minthara. Best not have them ask questions and fall in now. I will deal with the implications of this later. Gods, but do I love procrastinating? Why thank you past me, I grumble internally before finally deciding to check what changed within me. Blood of Dagoth. Lorcan's blood. Just one step below being an actual demigod, you are now touched with an aspect of Lorcan's domains, notably those of trickery, deception, manipulation, mortality, and defiance. Your blood desires more, it is yet incomplete. Ah, so that was the constant if silent hunger in the back of my head. Great, just what I bloody needed, a mental influence powered by a good known to not give a shit about the rules, and I can't even whack him for it. The Ultima are right, fuck Lorcan, all my homies hate Lorcan. I am probably overreacting. I sigh, I know damn well where I need to go to fix this, and the only thing making me angry is my pride. And thus enlightened, I shoved my worries into the deepest recesses of my mind, went on with reading the notifications. Star 56 to 80, Dex 58 to 86, Vit 85 to 120, Mind 93 to 125, Mag 1700 to 2100, 10500. I couldn't help but whistle at seeing the numbers practically explode compared to what they were before. Drinking compatible God's blood was just on another level, and I guessed as much, but this was way outside of my expectations. The bunch of large numbers may not seem terribly indicative of what I was experiencing, but I now knew for a fact that I had stopped aging, with my brain being so capable as to be able to scan every single cell of my body and notice that they were not degrading and were instead growing stronger at an admittedly slow pace. Yup, you heard it right. Your boy was officially an immortal. But wait, there is more. Dagoth's fury, Raven's reticence, a power once inherited, now made to be your own. A separate pool of power intermingled with your magicka, you are now capable of molding your divinity into any purpose you are capable of. Particularly effective against divines John Daedra, and scales with anger, John disdain, enmity you hold for the being in question. Ah, so this must be what happened when I offered a prayer to myself. My eyebrow jumps up and I hold out a hand, willing the power to move as I desired. And just like the description said, I felt a light film of energy peel off from the torrent of magicka coursing through my body and practically jerk into position with how eager it was to listen to me. Choosing to start it out slow, I made a grasping motion with said hand and willed the spark of shadowy grey divinity to form into a simple bolt. And once more, my divinity listened, forming into a perfect copy of my most basic attack spell. Before I fired it off randomly, though, I thought better of it and sent a mental nudge to my Daedric friend. Oi Mephala. A curious purr was the instant answer. You have some expendable Dremora prisoner. You don't mind me testing something on? Before a singular second could go by, a light flash of Daedric power appeared some 3 meters to my front, and Mephala's puppet body materialized next to me, the bound form of a distinctly Balite Dremora squirming under our gazes. How nice of you to finally invite me, dear. She purrs into my ear. It was very cruel of you to not call for me once you were done with the inexperienced little dragonling. Skill is half the fun, is it not? Each word was said with such an inflection that there was no guessing at what she was implying there. I, naturally, only gave her a deadpan stare at that, earning a chuckle from the eternally horny demon woman. Fine, fine. She raises her hands in surrender. What did you need the little pet for? Now that was a temptation I could get behind. Got something interesting in Sovngarde, wanted to see the effects, I answer simply. You're growing Aedric abilities? She smirks, why I would be delighted to observe. My amusement at her sudden bout of competitiveness did not go unnoticed, and her seductive smile swiftly shifted into a pout as she crossed her arms and looked away in a huff. I just chuckled, blink, and you will miss it, and launched a bolt of divinity at the Dramora's leg. The string of power was comparatively tiny to my usual bolts of fire, but the moment it touched Molly's little slave, he burst into a flash of grey flames before a soul-deep scream pierced the air and his entire form was shattered. Shattered, not banished. Oh my, Mephala voice now lacked any playfulness. That is quite scary. My eyebrow rose. Should I expect attempts to remove the threat? The threat is what makes life fun, my dear. She smirks. Though I would recommend you not spread the news, as it were, most others are still far too skittish about such simple things as death. Right, I snort. I will be saving this up for a certain squid fucker anyways. She pauses and blinks before her smirk grows even wider. I will be watching eagerly, my dear. Her smirk disappears as she sighs just a tad bit too dramatically. I must be away now, dear. Dramora do not die just like that, and I can't let Molag get suspicious. Do enjoy yourself. She disappeared before I could answer, and just in time as well, as a moment later I could feel more than hear the distinct noise of levitation, and within a few seconds a rather tired and excited Minthara stepped onto the platform atop my tower, her legs wobbling uneasily as she landed. The first thing I noticed was the folded scroll with the mead sigil on its broken seal. The second was the fact that Minthara refused to meet my eyes, even as she walked past me and took her own seat, her face resembling the color of her hair near perfectly. A smirk was already worming its way onto my face. It was time for retribution. My heart beateth with a rising greed. Many a stone more do I need. My desire you will heed, or soup will have those who did. Chapter 382, Chapter 2, Imperial Summons. Why good morning, Minthara? My grin was one of rather disturbingly shit-eating proportions as I gave her a wave of greeting. I do so hope you had a nice rest. She looks up before looking away the moment she met my eyes, the quietest morning stumbling out of her mouth. Why so distant, I ask, channeling my inner Mephalan. You were quite enthusiastic just a scant few hours ago. Where did all that bluster go, I wonder? She stills completely before letting out a long sigh and getting up. I blame the mead. And before I could point out she could no longer get drunk on the mortal stuff, she walked across the lounge and plopped herself into my lap without the slightest bit of hesitation. And you pretended to die like a cunt, she adds with a huff, the physical contact calming her considerably as the thought of my potential death still unsettled her. That was quite cuntish, I will admit. I grin as begin lightly massaging her shoulders and channeling the slightest bit of my divinity, making her practically melt into me. Thankfully, she was just short enough for that to not be uncomfortable, which was more due to me being a very tall Dunmer and less about her being short in truth. She was quite tall for a Nord woman. It would seem, though, that your little punishment. My grin widens and she lets out an embarrassed whine. Got turned on its head. Mephala was indeed right. Experience did trump physicality. Shut up, she mumbles and whacks my leg with a balled fist, getting absolutely no reaction in return. I heard people talking about it for years and I got curious. Unable to contain it, I let out a loud snort. Well, you are quite lucky my tastes lean towards the more exciting experiences. I chuckle. Most other people are too. Brittle, I'd say. Their loss. She huffs before quietly adding, besides, that lady of yours who keeps following you around, Mephis or something, said you'd like it that way. Each word was quieter than the last as she gave in to the unreasonable need to explain herself. Fucking Mephala, I snort once more. She stills again before leaning back into me. That makes too much sense. I wasn't even really trying to hide it. I shrug, lowering my hands from her shoulders and embracing her from behind, refuge in audacity and all that. Well, whatever you were doing seems to have worked. She spoke after a full minute of comfortable silence and brought up the scroll. A letter came from the Imperial city. Titus's congratulations, no doubt. I quirk an eyebrow. That and a summons. She nods, seemingly disappointed that she already had something new to do. He says he wishes to introduce me to the council and heavily implies that he wants my help in at least ruining their influence, if not outright disbanding them. A full disbandment may be foolish, I think, I mention after a moment's ponder. Having a representative body in an empire as large as Tamriel is a must, especially with the different cultures and faiths. To have a purely Cyrodiilic government would quickly alienate everyone else. That, she stops and takes a moment to consider, is a very good point. Titus always raves on about them being useless career politicians that cared more for their own purses than actually serving the Empire. I haven't even stopped to consider the reason for their existence in the first place. Oh, they will still need a quite thorough purging, don't get me wrong. I chuckle darkly. Just have them replaced after the turbulence dies down, and no one will make problems. With fanatical loyalists preferably. Trust me, you don't want to run the whole thing yourself. You will go insane faster than the mad god can make another incomprehensible pun about dairy products. She blinks at that last bit, letting out a short chuckle at the absurdity of it. Cheese aside, thanks for the advice. She sighs. This whole ruling the empire idea has me worrying to death, and I haven't even been announced as heir yet. Do not worry yourself overmuch, I say with dark amusement, lacing my voice. It will only get worse. Oh no. She pretends to whine while her face is stuck in a deadpan. You will survive, I am sure. I hum. He say anything else? She tosses me the scroll and give it a quick skim. He summoned you as well, though worded more politely than that. And had my father's manor fixed up and all of his possessions returned. I raise an eyebrow. It will be nice to go home, even if I barely remember it now. I had forgotten you were from Cyrodiil. She looks up at me with what she no doubt considered a coy smile. Think you could show me around once we get there? Why, my lady, I would be honored. I bow my head as dramatically as I can. She lets out a rather unladylike giggle at that before leaning back into me, staying silent for a while longer. Finally she sighed and spoke. Raven, what are we? A pair of the most glorious godslayers Tamriel ever did see. I grin, an expression she could not see but could definitely feel. And there was the elbow. No mercy on this one, I swear. Not that you arse, she huffs, and once more looks away in embarrassment. You know what I meant. Lovers, quite plainly, I point out bluntly, as I knew the sheer brutal annoyance, self-doubt was in these kinds of situations. Or have you already grown bored of me? What? Of course not. She rounds on me before seeing my amusement and huffing in exasperation. I just do not know how to proceed, she asks more than states. By not trying to rush things, I answer, practically reading her mind. If we had an abundance of anything, that something would be time. Right, no rushing, got it. She says more to herself, probably wiser than anything I'd have come up with, she admits sheepishly, as if anything else but pure wit could ever leave my lips. I nod smugly. The look she gave me seemed to imply a lack of confidence, but I could for the life of me not see the reason for such a travesty ever happening. We spent a while longer atop my tower before we both decided it was high time to get moving and start our preparations. Neither of us actually considered not going to Cyrodiil, but when you are as famous and or influential as we are, things naturally needed to take more time than us, simply flying over the mountains atop a pair of dragons. Speaking of dragons, those wise enough to swear their fealty to Minthara after Alduin's quite deserved death had decided to inhabit the mountains around Silruan Fell whenever they were not talking to their brothers on the clearing behind my tower. Even if they were still very much so beasts of conquest and destruction, they seemed a lot calmer now, more willing to talk things out, and far too afraid of the duo who killed their eldest brother to act out, or at least be the first ones to do so among their number. They inevitably would, so all we could do to reduce the number that ultimately had their souls nommed was send the most belligerent of them to Hammerfell, where they would bring all manner of suffering upon the Thalmor. Having my potential enemies and current enemies butcher each other aside, Parthenax had also turned quite active recently. Visiting any dragon who would give him the time of day, he tried imparting a somewhat modified version of his way of the voice on them. He had at first intended to do so without any changes, but one long conversation with Minthara and myself convinced him quite thoroughly of just how terrible an idea that would be. Pacifism was a personal choice and never worked for a whole civilization or community in the vaguest sense for the Dove. A day after we had received the summons, I went to Solitude to participate in my final court meeting in the Blue Palace. My resignation from my post as court mage was an already long-established fact, and now that most of the closest threats had been dealt with, it was time for me to move on, and the stringy-ass Altmer they had chosen as my replacement to take the post in full. I almost pitied him for the expectations he was no doubt about to be drowned in, but the riches he would gain would no doubt make up for it in time. We spent a full 12 hours debating and deciding on things, with Torrig doing his absolute best to get as many ideas out of me as he could before the timer was up. Many things were decided on, and many others delayed for a time where resources weren't quite as scarce. Notably, the reconstruction of Falkreath would be done in a more planned manner, with better walls and roads being the priority as the people re-established the once quiet city. Said roads would then branch out into the rest of the holds and forever connect the lands of Skyrim. Another big decision was the centralization effort Torrig would implement, ensuring that the big settlements would use the opportunity given by the large refugee crisis to grow instead of getting bogged down with another Solitude sprawl situation. There were some more minor decisions being made, but all of it had to do with infrastructure and disaster relief, which I was so thoroughly bored with during the meeting, I'd feel ill repeating it within my own mind. The goodbye ceremony, feast they prepared for me, and of course the vaunted Dragonborn, who just happened to be visiting at the same time, quickly turned into a citywide celebration as we were practically dragged through the whole thing while the people went into multiple brawls with each other in an attempt to be the swiftest, to present us with thanks, congratulations, blessings, gifts, or all of the above. Needless to say, after 3 hours of this, I just noped out and teleported the both of us away, with Minthara taking the moment to visit all of her siblings and emerging from the experience a fair bit more satisfied than the last time. Her little sister Bella had officially joined us, and I would leave her at Tel Dagoth to be trained as a healer, just as she had been promised months ago. I naturally pretended to grumble about it, but would never actually stop a person with magical ambitions from throwing themselves into my clutches. Just had to make sure that future requests took some consideration, of course. Next came Davos's and Nightshade's big day, which was visited by the near entirety of my growing city's population. The two of them were quite loved by those they had under their wings, and the gifts they received were quite lavish indeed. Though I will admit I may have gone juiced a tad too far by giving them a whole-ass mansion near my tower. Just kidding. I gave no shits about their gapes and merely took pleasure in knowing I had an immensely powerful family loyal to me for centuries. The ceremony was, naturally, performed by my most beatific self. I was qualified for being a high priest of a good half-dozen religions at this point, so in the name of Auriel, the ancestors, and the good Daedra, I bound the two in sacred matrimony, and the people cheered. The fact that both Aedra and Daedra were invoked in the ritual failing to create a singular problem within my, at this point, quite syncretic population. The guests were far less enthused, but knew when to speak, and more importantly, when to not. Yet more days passed after the wedding, and our preparations were nearly finished. Minthara's followers, who had named themselves the Dragon Banner, had mostly chosen to follow us down south, with recruits flocking to their ranks in great number, but only a few being accepted into the new, mostly Nordic brother-sisterhood. It would seem the Varangian Guard would be a thing even in this world, and I was all for it. My own entourage would consist of 100 of my most elite soldiers, most of them armed with the by-now customary halberd or crossbow as the main weapon, with only a few of the veterans taking on a more personalized choice. Most of my retainers would remain here, however things needed to be kept orderly, and I was taking more than enough people of note to aid me if I ever needed it. Notably, those that would follow me would be Anondor the Paladin, Alor of the Falmer, Jackal, who was Davos's right-hand mer, Eldor the now-budding merchant, and Idrassa because fuck letting her have a moment's peace. Jesus, I was a smug asshole sometimes. And so, after a full week after Titus Mede II sent his invitation, we set out from Silrune Fell, appearing near the Pale Pass through one of my way shrines and beginning our march south. It was time to make yet another court, my bitch, only this time I would have to deal with actual intrigue instead of gnawed bluster. I couldn't bloody wait. Chapter 383. Chapter 3. The Trek South. Marching down the Pale Pass and beyond the Gerald Mountains was like entering another world in its entirety. The endless forest of evergreen trees I got used to in Skyrim was now replaced with a sea of brown and orange, the late autumn, early winter, making the sight of northern Bruma all the more beautiful to behold. I had seen the sight a few times before, of course, both during my youth and my visit during Minthara's stay in the Empire, but the contrast was such that I felt pointing it out twice was apt. Though what truly made me feel the whole other-world shtick was the fact that even in the aforementioned late autumn, this place was still warm, protected from the northern winds by a massive mountain range and basic geographic latitude. It was definitely more pleasant for someone of my race, even if my robes were enchanted to oblivion and back to make things more comfortable. There was no beating the feeling of not being just an inch away from the frigid cold of the north. The Nords were faring far less pleasantly, however, as many of their fur-clad forms slowly begun to stink from sweat, the protection from the cold inevitably becoming a burden as well as their adaptation to it. Something I would have to deal with promptly, lest I have to smell that crap the whole way down. Or just cast a wind cloak at minimum power, either could work. A light, annoyed grunt drew my attention from the rising stench and onto the person clumsily riding a horse next to me. Minthara let out a huff as she finally managed to right herself in her saddle. I still don't see why we couldn't have just flown in there, or teleported at least. Presentation. I grin, rolling the R and earning myself a glare. Rising my hands in faux surrender, I let out a chuckle and explained, going there on Dragonback would have made us look like invaders, and showed our hand far too quickly. Teleporting would do much the same, as it would tip the balance of our delegation more in my favor, and I need to be seen as the follower here. I tilt my head in thought. That, and we need to spend the time marching with our little army as a proper show of strength. Why do you have to speak sense? She grumbles, and why do I have to ride this damned thing? Her horse lets out an annoyed huff and trembles, almost sending her tumbling down. Ornery little thing, isn't she? I chuckle at the hardy northern steed. Minthara, being capable of pattern recognition, visibly holds back another insult to her mount, and instead looks to mine. How do you keep that monstrosity this calm? Ah, my sweet Glitterhoof, the destrier gifted to me by Torrig. What a truly glorious beast it had become, standing well and truly above its kin and carrying a sharp intelligence in his eyes, for an animal at least. Minor binding ritual, I shrug. I also have him fed and properly taken care of, so he has no reason to be a twat about the privilege of being my mount. And he is far less chatty than your preferred mount to boot. I chuckle. Minor binding ritual. Right. Her eyes narrow at the obviously magical horse that had been through a good dozen or so empowering rituals so far. Also, dragons are a superior mount, and you know it. Because you don't have to put any effort into riding them. I quirk an eyebrow. I was made to rule the skies. She throws her hands up, not lose my mind atop this. She pauses, giving a worried look to her mount, who seemed just about ready to react if she dared say something again. Matt, if you are so bothered with it, you could have just created a familiar. I drawl out with only a bit of mockery. It would have probably grown to the point of being rideable, but no, you couldn't play with your powerful soul because you apparently know better than Phineas, Shalazar, and myself. Humph. She huffs, but doesn't retort, knowing damn well she would lose that battle quite thoroughly. Wisely, she chose to change the topic, also binding ritual. That horse of yours barely even looks like a horse at this point. I may have gone a bit overboard, I admit somewhat sheepishly. Glitterhoof was indeed a unit, the mere thought of which quickly brought me to his predecessor, Nimhe. A shiver went down my spine as I remembered the now towering orichalcum chitined once frostbite spider which was stalking the deepest depths of Silrune Fell's valley, slaughtering all manner of beast, and any farmer unlucky enough to have no magical potential. The ones that did would likely forever have traumas about enclosed spaces as their cocooned forms were dropped off in the forbidden part of my domain, almost daily. We did not talk about Nimhe. Our reception in Bruma was that of kin welcoming kin. The Nord-blooded Imperials in the city eagerly welcoming the conquering heroes, and the people themselves practically throwing out the red carpet for us. I would find out later, much to my pleasant amusement, that none of our followers paid for a singular thing in the city. Within reason, of course. The Count, one Roland Carvain, a young man whose look and demeanor was somehow a perfect mix between a Nord and a Nibanaean Imperial, welcomed us with acceptable pomp and ceremony, throwing a grand feast for us and not quite demanding to follow us along on our march to the Imperial city with a good chunk of his entourage. The Tamrielic equivalent to a Norman, as I've come to consider him, and a good chunk of his people, was quite the affable man in his early 20s, almost always seen carrying at least a suit of chainmail and his sword wherever he went. He had earned something of a name for himself by hunting down the goblin tribes in the surrounding areas with acceptable zeal. That the green little shits had begun swarming due to the sudden disruption made by dragon raids south of the mountain range made me quite furious. But that they were mostly culled down to reasonable numbers was a good balm on my raging soul. My gleeful congratulations for his deed did earn me some looks, but I was not bothered. The green taint had to be expunged at all costs. Also, no one was willing to say anything, as Titus had well and truly gone wild with the propaganda, and not knowing of the deeds of the Godslayers was a challenge, beaten by only the most reclusive of hamlets. Roland also further proved himself by possessing more than a single brain cell and offering his support in matters within the capital, as he put it. He was trying to be coy about it, skirting around the topic of Minthara's purpose down south, and said demigod apparently had no patience for it. The moment she pulled out the restored Amulet of Kings, the man fell on one knee along his entire household and swore an oath of loyalty then and there. A supremely useful ally, especially with his position between our most loyal power base and the beating heart of the Empire itself, something that had to be secured against fuckery post-haste. The young man was quite confused when I outright told him, in a private meeting of course, that I would be stationing agents around his city, but it only took me pointing out that if I wanted to do any harm, all I needed do was cast a single siege spell upon the mostly wooden buildings of the city for him to accept my gift with restrained resignation. He'd be thanking me when his family was alerted of bandits, targeting them days before the bandits themselves knew it, but for now I was content playing the scheming wizard cop to Minthara's glorious conquering hero cop. After 3 days of rest in Bruma, our growing force set out once more, this time marching straight to the Imperial city itself. Home sweet home, were the first thoughts that entered my mind, sarcastic as they were, as beheld the downright gargantuan cityscape that greeted us as we crested a hill, the great white gold tower having been a constant sight to our south for days now. The Imperial city was magnificent to behold. Even in its current reduced state, the great concentric circular walls still gleamed in the sunlight, with each district looking as if it were a distinct monument in its own right. The arena, the temples, the market. I had been here before, obviously, but much like Bruma's forests, there was nothing quite like coming from the comparatively barren north and straight into the heart of civilization itself. Millions of people crowded the place, and even if the city was well and truly grand, it was not made to support the growing sea of tents and slums surrounding it, the population of the devastated west of Cyrodiil, having moved here decades ago and then refused to return to their homes once they settled in. Truly, the stubbornness of some people. I noted the need to resettle yet another bunch of ornery fucks once we managed to fully wrestle power for her overladyship. Slums offended me, and I would not have them when there was so much arable land around with food just begging to be exported to less prosperous parts of the empire. Satisfied with my decision, I returned to appreciating the actually worthy parts of the city. the statue of Martin Akatosh specifically taking in a good chunk of my focus. Not that my companions were any less amazed, of course. Roland and Minthara showed nothing, as they had gotten used to the sight that was the city, but the Nords and Mer that had followed us south all looked like their eyes had been opened for the first time in their lives. I managed to wrangle the lot of them back into moving, and soon we approached the aptly named City Isle, Fort Legion, standing just beyond the great bridge we crossed, and I could already see a full 4 cohorts of legionaries waiting for us, already prepared in a formation for an escort march. My eyes flashed with an extra bit of light as I went to see who led them, and I blinked in surprise as I swore I could see an older version of Tiberius waiting for us atop a great warhorse, and with a wide grin on his face. Julius Gracchus, then, an Imperial glory hound. I could work with this. A certain Imperial's POV. The usually loud Imperial city was somehow even louder today, the street between the arena and market districts filled to near bursting with the excited crowd, so much so that poor Ioannes could just barely push his way through the throng and finally managed to make his way to the Cup's Cradle Tavern. He gave the door a few rapid rhythmical knocks and was promptly dragged inside by a massive orc guard clad fully in steel plate. "You are late," the Orsimer accused simply. "You try pushing through this mass of sheep." Ioannes spits out, before considering his words and quickly shaking his head. "Actually, forget I said that. I don't need that kind of attention on me." Even as he said it, he could see the orc grinning a bloodthirsty grin under his helmet, the image of him pushing, trough the crowd bringing an involuntary shiver to the Imperial's spine. "Boss lady is waiting for you upstairs." The orc brings him from his confusion and points at the stairs. "She does not like waiting." "I know, damn you." Ioannes scoffs and gets moving without bothering with the orc any further. The beast was a terrifying thing, but it was loyal. He did his best not to outright run up the stairs, but it was a close thing, and soon he found himself atop a grand balcony offering a perfect view of the gathering. His employer seated in a lavish armchair as she sipped on a wine that was just a bit too red. A large shadow covering every single inch of the area, ensuring no direct sunlight could reach them. "My lady." Ioannes bowed and spoke in his most diplomatic tone. "I apologize for my lateness. My contacts were quite reticent until recently. Information loses value with time." His lady spoke, and the voice was like silk. "They likely failed to find another buyer and knew of your desperation." "Likely," Ioannes admitted easily. "I will ensure their businesses are punished accordingly, of course." "As you should, my pet." She smiled, and he did his best to avert his eyes. "Now tell me of the coming heroes, of their deeds and aspirations in truth, and not whatever drivel Titus has been feeding us." "Of course, Lady Isabella." Ioannes bowed and began recounting all he learned, his mistress smiling widely as he did, her vampiric fangs and blood-red eyes openly showing. Chapter 384. Chapter 4. The Grand Reception. General POV. Lady Isabella of the Vampirum Order of Cyrodiil took another slow sip of blood wine as her thrall continued his tales. She was half tempted to tell him how utterly ridiculous some of his contacts' claims sounded, but held her tongue for now, as she had long since learned that even overblown rumors would have kernels of truth to them. "Is that young Roland I see there?" Her eyes narrowed as she carelessly interrupted her servant with a raised hand. "Last I heard, he was too busy wasting his time watering the ground of Bruma with goblin blood to do anything else." "He must have been intoxicated by tales of glory," Ioannes dutifully suggests, as the large column of legionaries and warriors slowly becomes visible to his mortal eyes. The man may be more Nord than Imperial in his aspirations, but even he is not foolish enough to miss this kind of opportunity. The vampire let out a light hum and gave her thrall a slight nod, an acceptable rationalization. Or it would be if he were not so visibly deferring to that red-haired child. "The Dragonborn?" the olive-skinned Imperial asked. "That could prove dangerous. Or Titus has decided to play at horse racing while the rest of us thought he was playing dice." Isabella thought aloud, partly amused and partly concerned. Such changes were never pleasant to the monotony-loving order of vampires, and she was no different. It is better to be safe than sorry, so mark her influence potential up. Above the elf, Ioannis asked slowly. Not just yet. Isabella hummed. She may be powerful, so much that I can even feel it from here, but her influence seems limited to some few dozen beast slayers and a fearsome reputation. Ioannis shuffled on his feet for a moment, long enough for his mistress to turn on him with a raised eyebrow and signal for him to go on. He bowed his thanks and spoke, even if hesitantly, I believe this may be unwise, my lady. Fear not, child, she smiled at him hypnotically. I would not employ advisers if I was adverse to advice. Of course. The grown-ass man bowed again. The Nords value reputation above everything, and there is no greater reputation than being a hero of legend. I would not be surprised if most of the holds went to war simply because she called. I forget how different the Nords can be. Isabella admitted with only a bit of hesitation. Very well, pet. Note your thoughts down. It wouldn't do for the ancients to be misinformed, she said with a suffering sigh, which was a signal to pointedly hide anything of actual value he could, Ioannis realized. The order was rife with politicking, and his mistress would do her utmost to come out on top in the coming turmoil. If we survived? The stray thought struck the thrall, but he exorcised it just as quickly, thinking he was simply tired. The loud noise of the legionary march soon reached the inn they were perched on, the perfect lockstep of their armored boots only lightly broken up by the careless gait of the northerners, only for itself be drowned out by the downright pedantic march of the armored elves. The Nords were not terribly odd to look upon. Their arms and armor were typical to what Ioannis learned of Skyrim, if only of the highest reasonable quality available to them. But the elves were a whole different story. Each and every one of them looked to be armed and armored in equipment worthy of a knight of middling wealth, their weapons seeming both uniform and distinct to the thrall's eyes as each wave of the wind sent triangular black and purple banners fluttering in the air. Even his mistress seemed impressed for a moment, the expression swiftly snuffed out by centuries of training and experience. Then came the heroes of the day, all of them mounted and positioned between their footbound subordinates, and all of them looking thoroughly unique in their own rights. To say that the crowds went wild as the same saviors of the world named by the town criers throughout the entirety of Cyrodiil appeared before them would have been the understatement of the era. I had thought the tales of Falmer were just that, Ioannis admitted quietly, though loudly enough to be heard by the only person that mattered, to revive an entire race. While impressive, they are of little consequence and will remain as such for centuries more. Isabella waved the admittedly impressive bit of confirmation off. They are no more powerful than any other elf, and serve only to bring prestige to their master. As you say, my lady. Ioannis bowed. I would still recommend gathering as much as we can on them, lest they prove a hidden threat. He paused briefly. They were said to worship the sun in the texts I was able to procure. Isabella paused and nodded, rising her thrall in her estimations ever so slightly due to the sudden twang of fear in her back. Do so. He may be worthy of getting turned after all. The centurial vampire's eyes moved on from the entourage to the heroes themselves, resting once more on the red-haired demigod awkwardly riding what looked to be one of the rowdiest steeds she had ever seen. The image would have been amusing if not for the veritable torrent of power she could feel, just barely held back behind a youthful exterior. She wore gleaming steel plate, though the vampire doubted it was simple steel, and had a hammer tied to her horse's saddle that radiated just as much danger as its supposed wielder. She could also feel something even more powerful hanging around the young woman's neck, but could not see exactly what. If this woman wanted her and this entire district dead, she would not be able to do anything but watch helplessly. Isabella found she hated the thought with a passion. What do we know of her? She asked aloud instead. It was best to know how to avoid the force of nature if you could not tame it. Brash, arrogant, powerful. Ioannis listed simply a surprising knack for leadership and tactics with a streak of cunning most simply gloss over due to the sheer weight of her presence. The thrall looks up to his master, a possible target for seduction. No. Isabella dismissed the idea immediately. Too dangerous, and she seems to be riding just a bit too close to her fellow godslayer to risk it. Of course. Ioannes accepted the decision as one did the setting of the sun, as if he did not just propose manipulating a young woman under the control, both magical and not, of an ancient order of bloodsuckers. And then finally, Isabella's eyes settled on the elf riding beside the young woman, and she felt all her hairs go up in fear as she felt absolutely nothing from the figure. He was tall, taller than most Dunmer, and so much so he could fit into a group of Altmer without any issue. He wore full-plate armor made of enough ebony to buy a small city, which was then covered in a magnificent robe meshed with the god crystal perfectly. A red sash with black writing in Old Nordic woven into it fit perfectly into the ensemble, clashing just enough to bring out the rest of the outfit. He bore no weapons on him, save for the rather sharp points of his gauntlets, likely sharp enough to cut through steel with an alteration spell to boost his strength, Isabella concluded with some conventional knowledge of magic. Unless he went mad with power and drowned himself in rituals, the vampire noted but doubted the idea, as he did not seem ridden with deformities. In fact, the young elf looked as handsome as someone descended from the wastes of Morrowind could ever hope to. With long dark black hair accentuated by a single thin Nordic braid in a purple string on the left side of his face, the nod to his northern allies was accompanied by a long scar, no doubt purposefully left there as a personal choice. A neat goatee adorned the bottom of his suspiciously timeless face, and a pair of red eyes emitting a constant glow completed the image of someone both incredibly young and incredibly powerful. A pair of eyes that was currently being directed straight at Isabella. A sense of danger began building up within the vampire's mind, but before she could understand what it meant, the Dunmer Lord's eyes met with hers, flashing a far too bright red, the words "I see you" carving themselves into her psyche as she physically recoiled away from the sight, her back hitting the wall behind her and outright denting it under the sudden force. "My lady!" Ioannes jumped into action immediately, a potion of healing already in his hand, as he rushed to help her. But a raised hand stopped him, his mistress slowly getting up on her own as tears of blood marred her face. She closed her eyes and took in a deep breath. "I will live," she whispered hoarsely, even as she felt the telltale burn of sun magic under her skin. That was just a warning. The Imperial found himself trembling, both in fear of the elf and in fear of losing his mistress. Had she died, he would have followed her immediately. There was no point in living without her. "Ioannes," Isabella spoke after a moment, quickly drawing his attention, "I want you to investigate the death of Legate Viren as swiftly as you are able. It would do to ensure my observation is not perceived as an insult." Her teeth were definitely not gritted, but by sanguine she wanted to break them with how terrified she was. Raven's POV. "Fucking amateurs." I let out a huff through my nostrils and focused back to the platform laid out in the square in front of us. "Want me to burn the cunts?" Scorch asks with just a tad too much eagerness in his voice. I send a mental pat on his head. "Soon." "Someone you didn't like?" Minthara asked lightly, able to detect the sudden surge of illusion magic in the air on sheer instinct. "Just someone arrogant enough to show their face even if they shouldn't." I roll my eyes. I expected them to be more cautious considering our previous correspondence. Then again, there were another 6 pairs of eyes on us at all times, all of them carrying the telltale hunger of a vampire. The only reason I targeted the wench on the balcony was that she was far more powerful than the rest and was far more blatant in her ogling. It would do to make a good first impression and all that. And the way she was scrambling to buy my goodwill was amusing, so who knows? If she didn't fuck up, I may even not stake her out in the sun for the fucking gall of thinking she could influence us. "Ignore them for now." The rather gleeful demi-goddess waved the issue away. "We are here to be celebrated. Just listen to how the She swiftly clears her throat. "Imperials are praising us." Another cheer erupted to our right, and I saw her puff her chest in pride. "Your disdain for the mortals aside," I snort as her face reddens. It looks like Titus has finally decided to show himself. "We are ready to establish a perimeter, Muthsira." Jackal appears next to my horse and bows lightly. "Just follow along Titus's plans for now." I whisper with a wave of magic so the sound could reach the agent's ears. "There is no need to show our hands too quickly." He bowed and disappeared, the legionaries accompanying us, under the leadership of the far too jolly general who just couldn't stop asking about his glorious brave little boy, swiftly began opening up the path to the grand square, pushing the crowd away gently but firmly and letting us march in. The scene that awaited us was Titus Mede the Second, standing atop a great wooden platform, surrounded on all sides by the Penitus Oculatus, all of whom were clad in heavy armor and were currently keeping the tens of thousands of commoners away from rushing up to us. Our own followers marched out into the empty space and quickly organized themselves into formation, the Nords looking far more relaxed than my own people, but I would not begrudge them that. They were a rowdy bunch and knew how to fight with discipline when it mattered. As our entourage rode in, Titus rose his hand and most of the crowd quietened down. The few of those too mentally deficient to shut their gobs, quickly getting it done for them by their fellows. "Thank you." Titus spoke softly with a lightly amused expression on his face, yet his voice carried across the entire square as if he was right next to us. Minthara and I rode in front of the group, both of us dismounting in the blink of an eye and stepping in front of the Emperor of Tamriel, our heads lowering in a respectful bow before the old man, my Emperor. We both spoke clearly and loudly. I could see the act rankling Minthara's pride a bit, but all I could do was feel amused at the theatre, as a bunch of the nobles accompanying the Emperor from below the platform seemed to visibly relax at our supplication. "Rise," Titus spoke with a smile. "Those who would save our world and our lives need not bow before anyone but those they choose themselves." A bunch of the nobles grew outraged, while another bunch looked at the old man with respect, as we had in their eyes retroactively chosen to bow before him of our free will. "Fucking theatre," I couldn't help but mutter with a snort, and just loudly enough for the Emperor and Minthara to hear me. His eyes twinkled with further amusement as he spoke again, this time far louder than before, "Lady Minthara, Dragonbane of Solitude." His voice carried the weight of a veteran commander, and Lord Raven of Great House Dagoth. He gave us both respectful nods as he named us be welcomed into Cyrodiil and into our Imperial domain as honored guests. We both bowed again, but rose on our own. "Your deeds in the service of the Emperor are great, and many in number. So great are they that I could recount them for hours should I wish to." He continued as was agreed upon, presenting all our deeds as if we had done them together. From the destruction of the misguided Stormcloak Rebellion, foolish belligerents hoping to use mighty Talos as an excuse to gain power, to the slaying of the vampires of the north who desired to blot out the sun in an eternal night. Something which the crowd had never heard of, going by their sudden panic and swift increase in gratitude. Your might stopped an invasion of the Forsworn, cutting them down to size and finally beginning their integration into the civilized world, and your cunning uncovered the ruins of Blackreach, wresting the ancient wealth of the Dwemer from their unfeeling servants. His eyes met mine. "You have even undone a great injustice done to the world in more foolish times, and have brought the Falmer, ancient snow elves of Skyrim, back from the curse they were forced to languish under for thousands of years. But most importantly," his voice softened, "when Alduin the World Eater, prophesied to consume the world and everyone in it, descended upon the skies of Nirn once more from his banishment, you did not stand idle and wait for him to ravage the lands. No, you fought him and his ilk with all your might. You brought the people of Skyrim together, and with legionary and housecarl at your back, you struck against the ancient cult of the dragons, charging into Aetherius itself, without fear for yourselves, and slaying the vile beast in Sovngarde, home of ancient heroes. So tell me, your humble emperor, O mighty god-slayers." He bowed to us, and the crowd went wild. "What boon would you request for this grand deed?" The crowd hushed just as quickly, all of them too eager to hear our voices. As agreed, I was the first to speak, my purpose to sound just slightly greedy and disdainful of non-Dunmer. The Dunmer were left to fend for themselves in the Oblivion crisis, abandoned by the Empire in their greatest time of need, as the Red Mountain detonated and the land was covered in ash. I looked up to him with narrowed eyes. "I demand that aid in both food and builders be sent to Morrowind, and that my people may be aided in restoring their prosperity as members of this empire. He seemed to hesitate, once more just as planned, for my assistance to Morrowind was both a play at the crowd and nobles, and at Morrowind itself. Very well, Titus accepted after a moment. Though it will no doubt hurt the coffers, I will grant you this boon. That is all I ask. I nodded tersely, drawing interested eyes from some of the nobles. And what of you, Dragonborn? Titus looks away from me. What boon would you request of the Emperor for your mighty deed? When the time comes, and the Thalmor finally show themselves for the foe that they always were. She spoke firmly and loudly, her sheer presence making her lack of training in oration not matter one bit. I wish to be the one to strike back against them and lead our people in reuniting what was once broken. No words could have made me happier, Titus smiled. Granted. And once more the crowd went insane, many of them trying to bawl over the Penitus Oculatus guards, but were thankfully held back. Citizens of our glorious empire, Titus's voice thundered, so much so that the crowd calmed down. I thank you for gathering to welcome our heroes, nay the heroes of all Nirn, to your home. May they forever be blessed by the Nine for their deeds. A cheer resounded all around us, and the Emperor leaned and winked at us. Your manor has been restored and secured. Go and rest a while. There will be much work to be done after today. Deciding I did not want to deal with the crowd any longer, I gave Jackal a quick look and signaled for him to get the troops situated, all the while grabbing Minthara by the shoulder and appearing before a distinctly familiar manor in the Elven Gardens district. Well, I mutter, feeling just a tad melancholic. At least no one decided to demolish the damn thing. Chapter 385, Chapter 5, Lay of the Land. It was odd, walking through the main hall of the manor, memories which were certainly mine, but only ever experienced by a past self, which was at the same time me and not. The nostalgia was very real, though, so I would simply accept that the child who grew up here was just half a soul waiting to be reunited with itself. No point in getting into an identity crisis if I could simply choose to be both young and old Raven, right? So this is where you grew up? Minthara asks, her eyes wandering from the guest rooms to the dining room, and then to the stairs leading up to the rooms reserved for family. It feels normal. Too normal. I was a pretty normal child growing up. I huff with an eye roll, quite bookish for my age, but when your father is a renowned legate and battle mage, all you want to do is be just like him. Shame he got offed before he could teach me anything advanced, though. She remains silent briefly, probably feeling awkward at the whole dead parents thing, but her curiosity gets the better of her in the end as we begin climbing the stairs. So you only knew the basics when you left for Skyrim? Yup. I smack my lips. Just some basic healing, flames, and alteration. He was going to teach me firebolts soon and even gave me his notes on the spell, but then the whole Thalmor thing went down and I booked it out of here before I was eaten alive. Seeing the so-called nobles outside, I can't help but agree. She huffs. I could practically feel their gazes looking at us like prizes to advance themselves with. I let out a dark chuckle at that. Their reactions when they realize just who you really are will be a balm upon the soul. She says nothing, but her smile would have probably traumatized a child if they saw it. Here is the master bedroom. I point offhandedly. I can see you are tired, and no, don't try to lie to me about it. I raise a finger to forestall her, to which she just pouts. Go and relax. I want to go for a walk and reminisce for a bit. Fine. She pretends to grumble, the expression shifting into a playful threat. You better join me quickly. But of course, I raise my hands in surrender, my voice a perfectly dead drawl. I would never dare disobey your divine majesty. She huffs and crosses her arms. You better not. We both stare at each other for a moment before breaking out into a bout of light chuckling. Voice now far less derisive, I speak, I will be back quickly, just need to clear my head. And go to leave. As I step back out into the yard, I realize the feeling of nostalgia was hitting me far harder than I was initially willing to admit, especially when my gaze wandered to the trio of singed stone pillars next to the stone brick wall surrounding the entire manor. Images of training with magic and weapons went through my head, the proud or stern, depending on my success or failure. expression on my not-quite-father's face as he instructed me, and the annoyed yet loving torrent of insults my mother would throw at the both of us due to her own traumas about magic. So distracted by the memories was I that when I stepped out into the street, I barely had the time to move away and summon my weapon as a rather thick piece of wood attempted to smack into where my head was the previous moment. Unluckily for the assailant, however, my hands moved in a blur, and before they could even realize they had missed, a flaming sword was resting terrifyingly close to their neck, while a hand crackling with crimson lightning was pointed at their stomach, their very shadows preparing to stab them if they did not desist. "Stop right there, thieving scum!" His battle cry died in his throat as he realized the predicament he was now in. "Oh!" Narrowing my eyes at the initial words and their obvious sincerity, I slowly moved blasphemy away from the tall elf's throat and asked, "What kind of an idiot attempts to ambush a war veteran with a stick?" My plan was not great, I will admit. The increasingly familiar Bosma looks away sheepishly, "But I will not let you steal from that place, fiend." I blink, feeling more amused than anything else. "And how exactly am I supposed to steal my own property, you stupid git?" "Ray?" He not quite flinches away. What?" Letting out a snort, I unsummon my sword and calm down my magic, giving my assailant a once-over. And there he stood, very tall for a Bosma and with hair just a shade lighter than proper red. Vendel, one of the youth's child Raven had grown up with, and not a terribly bright specimen either. Still unable to string a sentence together, I mock with a growing smirk. "I see nothing has changed in the years I've been gone." "Shut it, you smarmy cunt." His whole demeanor shifts as he reacts to the mockery almost automatically. "How in oblivion was I to know you were ever to return in the first place?" "By listening to the news." I raise an eyebrow and cross my arms. "You know, the ones in which I was named specifically as one of the conquering heroes," I add with air quotes. "Who listens to that drivel anyways?" He waves me off as if I had just spouted something ridiculous. "They always lie, so what is the point?" "Not this time," I chuckle. "Anyway, attempted murder aside, I was not trying to kill you." He immediately interrupts. I slowly raise an eyebrow, look down at the small log he dropped, then at his admittedly respectable musculature, my eyebrows slowly but surely attempting to disappear within my hairline as he grew progressively more unsure. "All right, fine," he huffs. "I was not thinking when I should have been there." "Happy?" He huffs. "Indubitably." I drawl, and his eyes narrow. "Anyway, as I was saying before you attempted to pitifully defend your actions, how about you join me for a late-night stroll and tell me what has been going on in the district? I am sure we can find some ambitious street vendor selling food at this hour as well. Tempted?" "Sure thing." He fails to hide his enthusiasm at meeting an old friend. "I just hope it isn't one of those enthusiastic walks you always talked about." So I made the joke even when my memories were not yet awakened. Interesting. No, my enthusiasm has been exhausted by charging straight into the afterlife to fight a god. For now. He gives me a long look and slowly realizes I was not fucking with him. The propaganda wasn't full of shit then. "Why don't you tell me about what the rest of you idiots have been up to, and I tell you about my misadventures in return, eh?" I ask and wave my hand for him to follow as I begin to walk. With a reluctance I did not know him to hold, he accepted and we spent a good few hours discussing things. It was interesting, and by that I mean I got to listen awkwardly to the mundane issues of a group of friends I had forgotten I had, while realizing just how utterly insane my life had become in just a few years of time. It did not take me even an extra moment of thought to realize I would not have it any other way. By the time morning came and I managed to dislodge myself from the grip of a mumbling dragoness, my mansion had already been occupied by my guards and servants. It was large enough to hold my direct retinue and some 20 guards on permanent duty, while the rest of them were housed in the neighboring mansions, which we rented or bought without a care for the price. If the owners were unwilling to sell, Wheel Jackal was Davos's right hand for a reason, and they quickly found themselves with all of their dirty secrets displayed in neat Dunmerry-styled calligraphy, and one word away from being sent to the authorities. I still did pay them, however. After all, it was unquestionably I who was being the cunt here. no matter how much smuggling the fuckers were engaged in for whatever reason. And speaking of the professional spy assassin, he now stood before me while the rest of my subordinates were relaxing in the other parts of the living room. I have gathered a preliminary examination of the factions and groups of interest within the city and the surrounding isle, as you commanded your lordship. Jackal bows his head. However, if we were to name every single group as their own block of power, we would be here all day, so I have seen fit to organize them into sufficiently similar groupings. Good, I nod. I do not care for the minutiae, and I have you to deal with the information gathering for a reason. He bows a little deeper. Now tell me, what are these factions I am supposed to watch out for? By your will, he raises his head, I have seen fit to divide our targets into two differing levels of influence, the higher one being the leadership and high nobility, while the lower are those of influence but not true power. Appropriate. I fold my arms in front of my face. Go on. I shall begin with those of a higher influence, if it please you. Seeing me not move whatsoever, he goes on. The first group I would name would be the hardcore loyalists, Emperor Mead's staunchest supporters and true followers of Talos's dream. They are not the most numerous, but most of them are positioned around the city isle itself, preventing any potential coup should any of the others grow too ambitious. Of these loyalists, the greatest names would be the Count of Anvil and that of Bravil. The western flank and the centre. I hum along, wise of Titus to focus on those, continue. Indeed, Jackal nods. I would also note that the highest council of the Empire has been thoroughly suborned under His Imperial Majesty's grip and are unlikely to prove themselves an obstacle. I just whistle appreciatively. That he had no one but the most loyal in his council must have taken Titus decades to orchestrate. The next group of interest are the glory hounds, those in the Imperial administration who wish to relive the glory days of the Empire and reconquer its lost territories, earning themselves a place in history with whoever earns their loyalty. His eyes shift to the hall and vaguely in the direction of the stairs. They are unified under the leadership of the General Julius Gracchus, with the Count of Bruma joining them recently and are most likely to fall in line under her ladyship. I would also note that they count as the second most numerous group. Lightly amused at his term of address for Minthara, I just wave for him to go on. The third and likely most numerous group. Jackal flips the notebook, would be those I deign to note as simply self-interested. They may be won over by either policy, threat of violence or blackmail, and could be used both for and against your will if played correctly. The counties of Coral, Kvatch, and Blackwood fall into this rather wide category. I have also noted down the Westweald under Skingrad to be of a more reluctant outlook. He gives me a slightly sheepish look. Gathering information on them has proven to be something of a challenge, and all I could get with an acceptable degree of certainty was that they would protest any mention of going to war. Skingrad was ravaged quite thoroughly in the war. I hum, they will be brought into the fold one way or another, just make sure to penetrate whatever spying protection they managed. I do not like unknowns. Your will be done. He inclines his head. One last group of influence remains, though I would not call them as such in this instance. It is traitors, is it not? I ask lightly. Unfortunately so. He admits, not one bit surprised, I could guess. The county of Leowin has had numerous dealings with Dominion territories, so much so that I suspect their count and much of the nobility of the city has long been suborned with promises of wealth and influence. And a respectable threat of annihilation, no doubt. I huff with some amusement before turning serious, have extra agents brought from up north. I want exact confirmation of just who and how many have fallen, and I want a plan of purging them should it prove necessary. A plan is already in the works, he says with a perfectly blank face, even if I can feel his smug satisfaction. Good, I nod in approval. That is it for those of greater influences. Jackal returns to his notes. The rest are those of a lesser power base, but still enough to become an asset or annoyance should they be maneuvered properly. The Thieves' Guild is willing to cooperate with us. He immediately begins, for the right price, they will provide proof of corruption and information when your own cadre of agents find themselves incapable or insufficient in number. Pay them fairly. I note, best not have them annoy me. Of course. Jackal nods and goes on. The Fighters Guild has proven itself reticent in recent times and have begun demanding greater and greater payment due to supposed increases in job hazards, as they put it. Corrupt leadership? I ask with a raised eyebrow. A mix of truth and lies, it would seem. Jackal responds wryly, "It will take us some time to find out which is which." His eyes light up somewhat as he remembers something. I have also noted down the Synod as being in something of an alliance with the old Fighters Guildmaster, as they have been the most active Mages Guild inheritor, and their services have grown in demand as unrest grew. The Synod. I snort derisively as I remember that one group of idiots in the Rift, bunch of incompetent posers, the lot of them. Note them down for dismantlement into a proper college when the time comes, clandestinely of course. Naturally, Jackal allows himself an eye smile. The next group would be an alliance of merchants, with the vast majority of them unified under the East Empire Company after the fall of the West Empire Company. They mostly seek to protect their rights and wealth in these uncertain times, and are likely to be placated by simple way of concessions or promises of beneficial policy. Any more of them worth mentioning? I ask as I feel him coming close to the end. Just the Vampirum Order and College of Whispers. He hums lightly. The vampires we were yet unable to contact, as they have hidden quite deeply after your reception, while the college has already attempted to approach your loyal scribe, Alor, and extract information from him. The way he phrased it made me raise an eyebrow. Apologies were offered after sufficient threats had been delivered by your retainer. His eyes shift to a grumpy, as all hell Idrasa, a gift of delicacies in both food and drink, should be coming to the manor post-haste. Acceptable, I say idly, and of their goals? Power, as most mages are wont to do. He shrugs. They could be bribed, but are known for their use of the less palatable magics, so I would humbly recommend all dealings be left outside scrutiny. The last group, though I would not call them such just yet, would be the Faith. No doubt a Talos resurgence. I note glory hounds and traditionalists, I expect. Indeed, my lord. He nods. Most will follow Lady Minthara out of duty, but there will be grumbling. I will continue my observation of them. Very good. I clap my hands and get up, but before I dismiss the agent, I remember a certain cunt. Oh, and do be sure to look for a certain jester-looking fellow by the name of Cicero. I wish him and the coffin he lugs about found swiftly. By your will. Jackal bows again, though I feel his confusion at the command. Did you think I forgot about you, you slimy cunt? My eyes taken on a cruel gleam as I consider how very useful a demigod's corpse in the Night Mother will be. Chapter 386, Chapter 6, Meeting the Imperial Council. Well now, I barely contain a sigh. That is quite annoying. Understatement. A grumpy Minthara does not share in my restraint. One might find themselves wondering as to what exactly brought us such frustration so early in the morning, and the simple answer would be a rather large crowd gathered in front of my manor, all of them clamoring for some kind of attention or reason. An expected outcome, really. I mean, why wouldn't they want to meet the supposed heroes and shake their hands and whatnot? And it would have been perfectly understandable if not for the tiny little fact that our location was supposed to be fucking hidden. Or at least not immediately obvious, I mutter, my annoyance slowly growing into irritation. Do you wish them removed, my master? Akulakan questions bluntly. No. I shake my head. I really didn't like how he phrased removing them, and turn to my right. Jackal, find out which asshole organized this and have them brought before me when we return. He nods immediately but pauses. And what if they are of a more elevated disposition? My growing scowl twists into a cruel grin as I lean in and whisper, no one is untouchable. As it should be, he smirks under his mask. With that arranged, I turn to the current leader of my guard detail. Anondor, prepare an escort for us. Make sure no one from the crowd is hurt, but do not allow them to bog us down. The paladin of Oriel inclines his head and begins barking out orders. And by the time I was done organizing this, Minthara had already stepped out into the street and was talking to the various citizens of the Elven Gardens district, and answering their questions with a surprising amount of patience. To my surprise, it took her only a few minutes and a couple of well-spun excuses for the crowd to ever so slowly begin dispersing. Just like that. I will admit, I did feel my eye twitch at the simple solution I had discarded out of hand. What? The demigoddess raises an eyebrow, smugly placing her hands on her hips. Nothing. I snort. I just seem to have forgotten that people can indeed be reasonable at times. She chuckles at that. You need to get that paranoia under control, Raven. Hey, I point at her in faux accusation. It isn't paranoia if they are really out to get you. My lord, Anandor interrupts any further banter. The guard detail is prepared. Good. I nod and begin walking. Let's get moving. I'd rather not be late for whatever Titus has planned. First thing I am doing as Empress is revoking the stupid no-flying ban. Minthara grumbles as we begin the deceptively long walk to the central district. Yes, that little rule, one that I've been ignoring for years now, had finally decided to make itself a problem. One could not blatantly shirk the rules and expect to have an expedient political rise, so as annoying as it was, we had to slowly march to the white gold tower as the passers-by gawked at us. Truly, I realized after only a few minutes of walking, if I needed motivation to help Minthara ascend to the throne, the promise she had just made would have been more than enough. We did not head straight for the tower and were instead redirected to one of the many grandiose buildings built next to the innermost circular wall of the city. The central district housing numerous temples, shrines, manors, and high society services with the usual upscaled version of this world, allowing for an entire district dedicated exclusively to pure opulence. The husk of what was once Martin's Septim almost seemed to stare at us as we made our way to what looked to be a restaurant of some prestige, with the Penitus Oculatus already stationed near every potential entrance, even the windows in some cases. The captain leading them immediately recognized us and quite respectfully asked that we leave our guards outside, something we had no issues complying with, as Anandor swiftly moved my soldiers into position, while Skirnir Stormcloak, who had been granted the honor of leading this particular detachment of the Dragon Banner, did the same with his. We only brought one retainer each, with Aelor following me and Junior doing the same for Minthara, the rest of her band currently too busy exploring the city and the Blades, who had finally begun growing into their role, or Delphine specifically, as Esbern never had any issues to begin with, being wise enough not to outright show themselves. We were swiftly led into a large room, my sight allowing me to realize that the entire building had been emptied for the occasion, as only the cooks and the Emperor's own dignitaries were present within. The room was a nice and cozy, if understandably opulent space, a single large and curved table already half occupied waiting for us with seats prepared. Titus himself looked quite relaxed at the moment, a sharply dressed if somewhat reedy Bosmer man whispering something in his ear as the rest of his council all engaged in conversations and debates between each other. That naturally stopped the moment we walked in, the atmosphere growing tense, but not negatively so, as those who had not had the time to meet us in person began evaluating us and no doubt formulating questions they wanted answered. I naturally had no patience for such things. Titus. I greet the old man bluntly and he smirks as his people tense. Raven. He nods, obviously holding back a chuckle, and looks to his adoptive daughter. Minthara, do take a seat, you and your companions. As we do so, I see Commander Maro of the Penitus Oculatus I, Junior. You have returned to us whole agent, he states simply. The young woman gives Minthara a quick questioning look, and earning a shallow nod, she looks back to her superior officer. I have done my duty to the Empire to the best of my ability. Engaging in half-speak agent? A heterochromatic elf of the female variety asks, My, how impertinent. The Ultima Dunma hybrid speaks with false cheer. Agent Junior has been instructed to serve the Crown Princess primarily. The commander of the PO interrupts, Your questioning is unnecessary and a waste of our time, Seneschal. Need I remind you, Maro, that it is I who is in charge of keeping the Imperial household orderly, and not yourself? The woman looks to Minthara and inclines her head, the falsely cheerful expression never leaving her. It has been some time, my dear. Minthara visibly suppresses a shiver at meeting her etiquette teacher once more and makes a quiet gulp. It has, Lady Valina. She speaks with pointed neutrality, which seems to satisfy the cheerful hybrid for whatever reason. Do stop playing your foolish games, woman. A dark-hued man speaks with a distinctive Hammerfell accent, earning a swift scoff and ignoring said woman's retort as he looked at us. Alakim Arslan, Lord Admiral, at your service. You are the one who requested that massive rework of the Dawnstar dockyard. I raise an eyebrow. It was indeed I, little Lord Dagoth. He smiles with genuine cheer, the massive man's address of little, not feeling insulting in the least. Skyrim is rich in forests, and under the least risk of attack from our enemy, moving our shipbuilding operations, there is an obvious choice. Agreed. I nod. I did tell Torrig to accept the proposal, but you may have to wait while he deals with the Fulcreath situation. Speaking of Fulcreath, another man interjects as Alakim nods, clad in traditional Imperial garb with a few ceremonial bits of armor added atop it. I hear tell that Tullius has finally gotten off his arse in Windhelm and begun rooting out the bandits trying to take the place over. He looks at me. Supposedly he sent Gracchus's brat to do the job. He any good? A bit whiny, but he does the job. I answer bluntly to the man, the balding marshal of the empire and de facto chief of its armies, Valenicus Ionis. Just like his father, then. The old man, likely older than Titus himself, sneers, bloody glory-hounding idiots, the lot of them. By this point, Aelor had already taken out a stack of scroll-quality paper and began noting down everything that was being said, going almost completely ignored by most of the council and earning only passing glances and raised eyebrows from the rest. Peace, Valenicus. A Dunmer wearing armored robes with a scepter hanging from his belt and just within reach speaks up. Young Tiberius may be eager, but his magic is mighty. He is worthy of the task. Which is why you do not hear me protesting the posting Caledon. Valenicus scoffs. Merely the foolish brat's mindset. Oh, I wouldn't worry too much over that. I smirk cruelly, earning their attention. I have seen fit to beat the worst habits out of him by now. Why he may even become responsible enough for an actual command in a decade or so. The marshal huffs, even as the slightest inclination of his head signals his approval, while the mage's eyes light up as I speak to him. Lord Dagoth. He lowers his head with genuine respect. I am honored to be in the presence of the youngest archmage in recent history. You are a credit to your father. I thank you for your kind words, sir. I smile lightly. Battle Mage Caledon Varith. He introduces himself fully. You may of course call me Caledon. I would not dare impose formality on one of your might. I hear Minthara stifle a chuckle of some derision, but I find myself unbothered by the apparent simpering of the elf. It felt more like he was attempting to find motivation within himself to improve further than actually trying to get into my good graces, and that kind of mindset was to be respected at the very least. Speaking of Minthara, she was currently engaged in a conversation with an old Nord man, wearing priestly robes and an amulet of Akatosh, the two of them arguing with a shortish Breton clad in the most opulent clothing present, save for the Emperor and myself. The two of them berating the man for something he had said. Noticing me looking at them, the Breton's eyes light up and he barrels through the assault of words without a care. Ah, the Honourable Archduke Raven. He grins as he pointedly uses the Breton denomination of my title. Would you care to give us your opinion on this matter? Francis Vierre, the Lord of Commerce and effective Minister of the Empire's finances, had been attempting to convince Minthara to begin selling items in her likeness to finance further efforts in expanding the government's influence. The man was blatantly greedy, known to usually go far with his proposals for earning as much money as possible, and yet incredibly, unreasonably competent at his job regardless. The issue was that he was also known to do so despite his understanding of the situation and the negative connotations of his proposals. In short, he was an impressively skilled kleptomaniac. Selling the future sovereign's dignity like that is foolish. I state offhandedly, some things are meant to remain sacred, my good man, and whatever minor influx of coin you may receive for such a decision, it would inevitably be followed by a reduction in respect and loyalty. Hear that, Francis? The old Nord grins at him. Dignity. The Breton scoffs. What use is dignity when there is money to be made? Oh, I hear Minthara shift as she leans onto her hands, her elbows firmly planted into the table. Would you like me to sell you to a whorehouse then? she asks with a very unfriendly smile. I mean, what use is dignity if there is money to be made? The poor man stutters and begins waving his hands defensively before whatever rationality he had reasserted itself, and he began offering apologies and assurances. What a foolish young man. I hear the priest whisper, so much potential blinded by simple greed. No one is perfect, old man. I grin at him. Herjolfur Galefrost. He introduces himself, Archpriest of the Nine. And I am certain you already know of me. I offer him a wink, to which he huffs in that distinct old man manner everyone is familiar with. Technically a priest as well. I add somewhat less loudly. Yes. He hums. The touch of both Aedra and Daedra clings to you, young elf. We will see if this is a good thing or not. This time it is both of my eyebrows that end up rising. Don't give me that look. Herjolfur rolls his eyes. If we want any chance of reintegrating the Dunmer, then tolerance of some Daedric worship will be necessary, and I respect Talos far too much to allow prejudice to stop us. I stare at him for a bit and then chuckle. Out of all the people here, I expected you to be the annoying one. I incline my head. I thank you for proving me wrong. Pardon the interruption. Another voice cuts into our conversation as a rather petite-looking Altmer joins us. But I have some questions for Lord Dagoth. You kids have fun. Herjolfur chuckles and turns to Minthara to resume their conversation now that Francis had been quite thoroughly threatened into silence. The petite elf woman clears her throat just a tiny bit awkwardly. Ara Maris. She introduces, I am in charge of the Empire's infrastructure ever since my predecessor was caught in an accident. She speaks slightly too quickly as she does her best to meet my eyes, yet fails each and every time. A new addition, then. Someone not yet used to a position of authority. And what does the mistress of infrastructure require of little old me? I quirk an eyebrow. Hopefully nothing too untoward. The woman gawks at me before realizing I was speaking in mere jest, and letting out an awkward chuckle, a rather forced one at that. No, my lord, nothing of the sort. It is just that I have heard much of your work in solitude and seek some advice in how to best exploit the now opportunity for development in the north. The more she spoke of her actual work, the more confident she became. A rather good sign after her previously meek display. It would be my genuine pleasure, my lady. I smile and we descend into a long session of planning about roads and canals, something I had found I quite enjoyed, especially when it came to shaping the landscape. Ah yes, gouging my forcefully adopted ancestor's body interested me, how utterly vile. About an hour into the meeting, Titus lightly tapped his glass with a knife and a number of cooks entered the room, all of them carrying all manner of delicacies from all around the world, ingredients both mundane and magical, filling the table to the absolute brim. By the end of the little feast, I found that I may or may not have developed a rather ravenous hunger for Valenwood salad. Valenwood, the same place where the living forest forbade its inhabitants from consuming plants, yes. We couldn't allow for such tyranny to persist, now could we? I thought happily as I crunched on the magnificently refreshing bit of greenery, the concerned looks the Chancellor was giving me going completely ignored. Chapter 387. Chapter 7. The Elder Council. Alternate title, Meeting the Slightly Less Imperial Council. Now that we have all been fed and watered, I do believe it is time we addressed today's agenda. Titus spoke as the room quietened down. Marshal Valenicus' content expression immediately twists into a scowl. The Elder Council. Yes, quite. Titus's lip twitches up under his beard before he turns serious. As you all know, the regular quarterly session is to be held today, and it has been confirmed that the majority of the representatives will be present. So we are to entertain the petty bureaucrats even now. Marrow joins his fellow soldier in voicing his displeasure. I thought we were finally getting rid of the fools. Petty bureaucrats they may be, Commander. Francis Vierre speaks up. But they do have their uses, if we ignore their inefficiency, of course. I let out a light snort. You don't just disband an ancient fixture of every single Tamrielic empire with the snap of your fingers. I give the commander a serious look. That would just be asking for the Thalmor to leap at us while our pants were down. Marrow's frown deepens, but he slowly nods in acceptance. and yet their influence must be pruned. Herjolfa says the obvious, lest we permit the issues of the empire to persist, even as a new conflict approaches. Indeed, Duculus, the Bosma chancellor, nods. It is an unfortunate fact, my fellows, that we must toe the line between absolutism and appeasement in this case. The rescindment of the Talos ban has already seen some unrest rise among those less loyal to the Empire's dream, and should we push too harshly now, we may find ourselves open to attack, while, as the Honourable Lord Dagoth stated, our pants were down. I fail to see the issue with this. Battlemage Caledon speaks up softly. It is always wiser to use the least amount of effort and force to reach one's goals. If we can slowly suborn the power of the Elder Council while still not entering outright conflict with the Thalmor, I am all for it. But that does leave the question, Caledon. Alakim sighs. How long will the Thalmor be distracted with other things before their eyes return to us fully? Then we simply pretend their focus is unnecessary, Minthara says, with only a moment's pause. All eyes turn to her, and after they realize she wasn't about to elaborate, unprompted, the seneschal breaks the silence. Would you care to elaborate on that, Your Highness? It is simple, really. She shrugs with a rather devious glint in her eyes. We make it look like the factionalism is still there, while ensuring the loyalty of everyone where they cannot see us. That would mean delaying some of our more overt actions. Duculus points out, something which could lead to a great delay in our readiness. The delay would buy me valuable time to do my work in the north. Arameris adds almost absently, as she was still half focused on the plans she and I had proposed during our little conversation. A balancing act, then. The Chancellor hums in thought before meeting her eyes with Minthara. We would have to delay announcing your title, if you are content with that. She shrugs. Even if some idiot tried usurping us, everyone knows who holds the divine right to rule. Correct. Titus speaks up and cuts off some of his more loyal followers. So we are in agreement then. A delay in overt action favoring an increase in subterfuge. Indeed, Your Majesty. Duculus inclines his head, though the length of this delay should be discussed as well. The 3 months before the next Elder Council meeting at most. I speak up, drawing their gazes. Minthara's right to rule is not something that can truly be hidden, seeing as it is literally a part of the Imperial cult, and she didn't bother being too subtle about her ties to the Legion while we were still in Skyrim. She crosses her arms and huffs while looking away. I roll my eyes with some amusement, drawing quite a bit of attention to the byplay, and so we should use the window of time before the Thalmor truly begin paying attention to deal with our greatest opponents on the home front. Maro narrows his eyes. I trust you will be making extensive use of your contacts. You can just call them my spies and assassins, Maro. I smirk. It is after all a religious rite for us. He scowls but doesn't correct me. The delay will make holding the cult together slightly more difficult. Herjolfa speaks up. But I do not foresee any great issues cropping up if I make my moves correctly. He gives me a pointed look at that. The dirt shall be delivered as ordered. I bow theatrically, and the priest does the amused old man scoff. It would seem that the skeleton of a plan has been created already. Titus draws our attention back by tapping his glass again, now to discuss the minutiae. The following 2 hours were interesting, to say the least. The chamber of the ruby throne was as impressive as it was massive, the pale marble-like stone used to make the white gold tower making the interior of the grand building look almost heavenly to behold, the just as imposing staircase leading up to the throne making the allegory even more blatant in my mind. Imposing as the seat of power was, the real mess waiting for us stood just below. The Elder Council had become so overly influential over the years that the space below the throne, previously used to hear out the greatest of grievances, was now completely dedicated to the meeting place of the most influential and powerful. There was still a space for grievances to be aired, placed oh so very neatly in the center of the chamber, exactly between the 2 rows of interconnected stone tables used to seat the councillors of the Empire. The fact that merely standing in such a spot, while surrounded by figures of power, would make most people shit themselves, went completely ignored, as these things usually were. The massive throng of nobles, scholars, priests, and wealthy merchants quietened down as we entered the throne room, Titus walking up to his throne, followed only by Commander Maro, while the rest of us were seated just below him at the head of the table. That Minthara and I were granted the seats of honor did not surprise many, but I still managed to hear some petty idiots grumbling about it. I took the moment of relative inattention to observe those gathered. The Elder Council, in its current iteration at least, made very little sense in the conventional way politics were meant to be done. It was like an arena of influence where the supposed best and brightest were chosen to represent their respective provinces and societal stations on what I would generously call whimsy rules of personal recommendations and one's ability to bribe enough such recommendations out of people. It was a complete and utter shit show, was the long and short of my impression. A proper parliament was something I could respect, even if it was usually nearly as flawed as what I was currently seeing. Hell, I could even go so far as to approve of the original idea of the Elder Council, and yet the idiocy of its operation was only second place in what irritated me the most about this. What truly infuriated my most enlightened self was the fact that this was considered to be in any way, shape or form acceptable conduct for representatives of the people. Feudal world pops. Scorch rolls his eyes. Don't get your robes in a twist. The fact that they even have some kind of council to check the ruler is impressive enough. Shut it, you discount piece of fried chicken, I whack him mentally, earning a surprised and betrayed squawk. I need to develop the appropriate sense of superiority so I can ruin all of their lives without feeling bad about it later. Yeah, that tracks Birdman lets out a beat of chirpy laughter. You know, the world would be so much better and safer if the stupid featherless degenerates simply accepted that worshipping Scorch, their gracious savior, was the way to go. That sounds like way too much work, I note, and he begins grumbling under the weight of the truth, his divine ambitions withheld. For now, honored members of the Elder Council, Juculus stands up from his seat while I was still bickering with myself. We thank you all for gathering today in service of the Empire and its Emperor. An almost mechanical agreement comes from the crowd with only a few truly earnest supporters offering their respect. The reedy Bosma ignores the blatant show of disunity and goes on, as is tradition, we shall begin by the council voicing their issues before the Emperor and his own advi. Why are those four in here? An opulently garbed Breton interrupts the Chancellor. They are not members of this council. I think I know you, I cut him off, remembering something Davos told me while we were discussing potential annoyances. You are the Lord of Menevia, are you not? Count, he corrects with grit teeth, and you are a meddling upstart. Still crying about Evermore's growing influence. I smirk, and the rest of the council is more than happy to observe the ensuing drama. Those fools are spitting on our traditions. The Breton Count ironically lets out spittle as he speaks. Had you not invited them, their foolish ambitions would have never gotten the chance to take hold. And now we have to deal with their foolish notions of equality and equal opportunity. Reynold, you beautiful bastard, I smirk. Are you accusing me of calling the Empire's might to arms count? I lean in slowly. Are you telling me that you supported Ulfric's little rebellion? That is no consi. He stops and realizes how many eyes were on him. I mean, of course not, Lord Dagoth. He speaks through gritted teeth. I seem to have misspoke. Indeed. I nod along, as if talking to a small child. You will also find, Count, that any of sufficient rank may attend these meetings. We wouldn't wish for such corrupt notions as exclusivity in the Empire's rule to spread, now would we? Sufficiently cowed, he shuts his gob. Such enlightening motions aside. A Balfiera Altma, judging by his garb, speaks up. I would like to inform the council about an increase in piracy coming from northern Hemmerfell, the Crow. And on it goes, multiple genuinely useful points are raised, while accompanied by just as many points bordering on the completely asinine. Tales of raids and increases in monster populations coming within the same session of some cunt from Nibonay, barking and howling how his favoured hist sap he uses for his hunting bows has gone up in price because of Argonian border tensions. That he was taken even half seriously left me quite miffed. Proposals were made, discussed, addressed, accepted or rejected. The council was surprisingly efficient, When it came to said discussions with things moving on with impressive speeds if one were to take Earth as a standard for such things. The biggest point of contention was, of course, the Thalmor. Even to the corrupt members of the Elder Council, the Ultima menace was not something one could simply ignore, even as their proposals to counter such was to give up even more ground and concessions. Many of the idiots even going so far as to blame Titus for his decision directly, the Count of Leowin being the loudest among them. The glory hounds also made their voices heard, as many of them clamoured for the war to happen as quickly as possible, and one of them even coming just a bit too close to suggesting that Titus be deposed in Minthara's favour so we could finally get some proper warrior's blood on the throne. I did not appreciate how he leered as he said that. And so he must die, Scorch decided. Finally, after some 6 hours, it was Titus's turn to make his own will known. The Emperor lightly waving his hand in his Chancellor's vague direction, and Juculus nodding in response. The Bosmer cleared his throat. His Imperial Majesty has seen fit to approve of a number of projects to restore our northern borders, now that the threat of the World Eater has been contained with a finality. His eyes sweep through the gathered councillors, basically daring them to interrupt him. The honoured Dragonborn, child of Akatosh, is to be awarded a mansion within the central district with all upkeep provided by the Empire for the remainder of her life. Some grumbled, but none protested. As per her request, the Dragonborn has also been granted an officer's rank within the Imperial Legion, and will be dispatched to pacify the points of greatest threat. Any who wish to join such an endeavour with forces they can afford are welcome to do so. She said it herself in our planning session. I will convince them by smashing heads, it is what I do. The glory hounds really appreciated this little bit of news. And speaking of our honoured heroes, Lord Dagoth's request shall also be granted, with the convoy to aid our distant comrades in Morrowind heading out after exactly 1 month from now. The Bosmer gave me a quick look, and I nodded. He has also volunteered to accompany such forces and aid us in restoring strained ties with his kin. Can the Treasury afford such an expense? One of the actually competent members of the council asked. It can. Juculus slowly nodded, especially with the series of projects the Emperor has seen fit to begin work on, so as to enrich both the crown and the people of the Empire. He claps his hands, and the surrounding guards begin handing out parchment for the council to read. And then they spent another 6 hours shouting at each other and trading favours so the actual work could get done before the next decade. Minthara looked just about ready to usurp the throne just so she could legally smack them in the head. Juculus was far more used to this idiocy though, and even as the sun began to set, he still spoke calmly. We are in agreement then. New roads and tunnels are to be dug atop the Pale Pass to ease trade, while the marshes of Morthal are to be drained and the land turned arable. The response he got was grumbling agreement. Excellent. He claps his hands lightly. I thank you once more for doing your duty to the Empire and bid you a good evening. I would also recommend remaining within the city limits if your duties permit. The Chancellor adds as the councillors begin getting up to leave. As the Emperor has seen fit to honour our heroes with a grand display in the Imperial arena, all councillors present are invited. Chapter 388, Chapter 8, The Arena. General POV. Citizens of the Imperial City, be welcomed back to this grand temple of valor. The announcer spoke over the loud voices of the crowd, his own words enhanced by some magic artifact. Today's festivities have been blessed by our very own Emperor, Titus Mede II, in honor of the saviors of our lives and aspirations, the twin banes of Alduin. The rowdiness of the crowd rose to such levels that even the artifact failed to overpower their collective voices. But the announcer was undeterred and merely waited a few moments. Your devotion and enthusiasm is, as always, delightful to behold. He looked to the VIP balcony and saw Titus raise his hand. And so, with the approval of our mighty Emperor, we need tarry no longer. On the northern side of the arena, we have the representative of the blue team. The man's voice rose. You know him, you love him, the orc, the beast himself, the slayer of minotaurs. Give it up for Gorgash. Said orc's fans went wild, and facing our beloved veteran, coming from the south and representing the yellow team, is a newcomer. a bard from Skyrim, a veteran of the Battle of the World's End, the writer of that delightful ballad, Alduin's Doom. Give it up for Marco of Solitude. A slight silence descended as the northern armor-clad Altmer stepped into the arena with a cheerful grin on his face, feeling only slightly awkward by the lack of cheers before a wave of noise from their sudden roar struck him so hard he almost doubled over. This is but the beginning of today's grand showing, my dear viewers, so do not bet all your money away just yet. There was a grin in the announcer's voice. And without further ado, let the battle begin. Raven's POV. My eye was twitching quite rapidly by this point as the stupid cunt began fighting the unreasonably large orc wielding a duo of axes. That little shit, I mutter with annoyance. A friend of yours, Lord Dagoth? One of the noble's councillors, given the honour of the Emperor's own terrace, asked, "Do you believe he will lose?" Hardly, Lord Anvil. I contain a sneer. I am merely annoyed he did not tell us he would be doing this. Gerald Anvil, Lord of the City of Anvil and one of Titus's loyalists, nodded. He is a member of this new dragon banner, yes? Concerned, Count? I quirk an eyebrow. Not currently, no. He smiles lightly, his eyes focused on the flurry of blows below us, merely questioning the prudence of founding a new organization at this juncture. Groups created by such auspicious personages tend to retain a certain level of pride and influence well into the centuries. A valid concern. I nod, marking the man just ever so slightly up in my estimations. But we felt it best to both reward and guide the veterans of such a grand conflict into doing something productive instead of risking them drowning in obscurity and creating problems later. Ah, the man nods his surrender. A reasonable argument, my lord. Though I must ask, is the dragon banner not a force under Lady Minthara? Fishing for information already, Gerald? I turn to him with light smirk and a raised eyebrow. Merely concerned for the future, Raven. He smirks back, the courtesy we shared, yet another silent agreement. Planning around such things is far easier when one is thoroughly informed, after all. Yeah, as if I would make it so easy. Then in the interest of being sporting, let us just say that two heads are better than one and leave it at that. It takes him a moment, but his eyes soon light up with interest. Most interesting indeed. He hums, "If anything, the future shall be most entertaining to observe." As it always is. I smile thinly, and we both look back to the arena, just in time to see Marco murder-stroke the orc in the neck with the guard of his life-leeching sword, the poor Orsimer folding like so much parchment under the sudden force. There was a short silence as the orc didn't get up, but then Marco proceeded to begin healing him, and the crowd went absolutely wild. A murr of the people, it would seem, Gerald comments. I huff. He has his moments. Meanwhile, Minthara's POV. Having grown completely bored with the fight, I decided to make my rounds and speak with Titus's councillors, asking for their advice about whom to ally and whom to weaken while the opportunity was still fresh. It was when I approached the Imperial battle mage, standing next to a very young-looking Dunmer girl, that I found myself in my current situation. By Azura, by Azura, by Azura. The girl clapped her hands excitedly. It is you. It is really you. Caledon, who I found was her father, was currently staring off into the distance, his eyes completely unseen under the shadow which had overtaken them. Back to Raven. Suppressing the sudden and inexplicable desire to laugh my absolute arse off, I observed a Breton spellsword get nearly disemboweled by a Redguard dervish, the dual scimitars turning the poor fucker into something barely above mincemeat. Not healing that one, I don't think, Scorch observed from atop my shoulder. That the crowd was even louder than when Marco healed his opponent was quite indicative of the true nature of the arena. The Imperials sure do love their blood sport. My eyebrow twitches. And speaking of blood sport, I round on my newest guest. How can I assist you? The admittedly beautiful woman, trying to stealthily draw my attention, flinches, but manages to control herself quite skillfully after only a moment and casually leans onto the balustrade next to me. Your perceptiveness does you credit, my lord. The woman's voice is like silk, but I had long since gotten used to those who abuse seduction for their ends and merely raise my brow at the attempt. Very slow to learn your lessons, aren't you? The vampire I spared yesterday bows her head slightly. Apologies, old habits die hard. Especially in the case of someone refusing to remain dead. Scorch immediately quips, and her constant smirk cracks just a little bit. Speak your desire, vampire. My order lacks all my previous amusement. The fact that she had infiltrated this place meant she probably mindfucked someone, and that was only okay to do against assholes, or when I did it. Yes, I am a hypocrite. I know, and I do not care. Of course. She visibly holds back a barbed response. First, I wish to thank you for your mercy during the parade. My staring was rather impertinent. What an ass-kisser. And I have been tasked with establishing contact with your new faction in the capital by the ancients. Your gratitude is accepted. I note blandly, though do keep your nose clean, as I do not give third chances. Of course. She bows her head. As for the contact your order, I sneer, wishes to establish, I trust that you brought an adequate offering for me to even consider it after your foolish attempts with the Volkihar. Also do introduce yourself. Calling you generic vampire hag in my head is becoming tiresome. Oh ho, almost had her there, judging by the twitching of her fingers. Sadly, she has more wits than that. I am Isabella Tor, late of Coral, my lord. It is so funny watching someone so utterly furious trying to appear polite, and I have procured information you may find valuable. Already currying favor, are we? I smirk and she twitches. This is too bloody fun. Not a very good showing for an order now, is it? But do tell me what you have. It would be rather uncouth of me to ignore you outright. The now named Lady Isabella pulls out a small booklet and offers it to me without a word. Rolling my eyes at the blatant attempt at information gathering, I flick the booklet open and begin flipping through it at downright unpleasant speeds, skimming the whole thing in moments. Interesting. I mutter I was going to have my own people investigate this, but more important matters have been on my mind. She looks like she wants to ask me if it is enough, but holds herself back. Sufficiently amused, I decide to have some small mercy for now. Your offering is acceptable. Have a contact sent to my manor so that we may continue other beneficial dialogue. Your generosity honors us. The woman bows and gets the fuck away from me. Got all that, Aelor? I ask the hooded Falmer. Of course, my lord. He nods. Would you like me to begin planning a dismantlement, or do you prefer them as your puppets? Puppets will do for now. I hum as I consider the rather extensive notes on the investigation into my parents' deaths that had just been handed to me. Unless we find that they are trying to play me for a fool, of course, then we stake them into the sun. As is right and proper. Alor nods somewhat smugly. Only those vampires blessed by yourself should remain under the sun, no? I huff and give him a wry look. You've grown cheeky. I learn from the best. He bows his head. Damn straight. I nod in approval. Back to Minthara. While your offer is appreciated, I feel my lip twitch in disgust at the fat man who had just all but propositioned me. I find myself entangled in other duties for the foreseeable future. Of course, young lady. The 50 or so looking fat piece of lard chuffs. Do be sure to use my company for your band's supplies, though. I wouldn't want our honourable saviour to be undersupplied due to subpar partnerships. Looking far too smug about himself, the pig walks off. Skirnir. I speak in a dead tone. I Dragonborn? Stormcloak looks up from the arena. Remind me to have Raven ruin that little shit. I grit out. The man guffaws. I Dragonborn. And back to Daddy D. Ladies and gentlemen of this beloved city, the announcer drones on as the final fight approaches. Today has been a most exciting showing by our valiant fighters in the arena. Champions both old and new have spilt their blood both for you, their adoring fans, and in the honor of the divines and our emperor. Really laying it on thick, isn't he? I ask the man sitting next to me. It is his job. Titus chuckles. And it isn't like the crowd is full of philosophers who will question a bit of encouragement. Bread and circuses, I mutter with an amused snort, keep them entertained and go around them in the background. A classic stratagem, I know. The Emperor of Tamriel chuckles and turns to me with a smirk. But why change what works? Why indeed? I hum and tune back into the announcer's rambling. Coming in from the south is our newest dark horse, representing the yellow team, the high elf of the north, the wielder of thunder and blade, and a mind as artistic in slaughter as it is in music. Give it up, Fu or Marku. The moment the slaughter bit gets mentioned, I see the poor dumbass wince in disgust. Oh, I am so annoying him for this later. And coming in from the north, the last standing of the blue team and the champion of this arena. Let us all give our applause for Roderick of Daggerfall. A fallen knight, a slayer, an undefeated lord of battle. Let us see if our newcomer can face the veteran of 100 challenges. I observe the fully armored Breton for a moment and then shake my head. Losing faith in your apprentice? Titus asks, as the two begin to clash after some words. The Breton is powerful, I note, and has honed his people's instinct for magic resistance to a dangerous level. Marco lacks a weapon to pass his armor reliably. I personally think your friend will manage to surprise us. Titus hums. Oh. I look at him with some curiosity. Willing to bet on that? You would bet against your own. Titus chuckles. I shrug. The Breton isn't nearly stupid enough to actually kill him, so why not? Ha! The Emperor barks a laugh. Very well, mark me down for 50,000. Conservative, I mock playfully, and we turn to look at the fight. And just as I predicted, while Marco does put up a good fight, Roderick simply tanks his attacks while delivering blows too heavy to immediately heal and slowly building up to a win. His pommel smashes into Marco's face, sending him sprawling into the sand, and the Breton momentarily looks like he is about to finish him off, but instead grabs him and begins to carry him out of the arena. Exactly as I have said, not an idiot, I point out as Titus grumbles. And what would you have done if he was an idiot? Commander Maro asks from nearby. Then I'd have made his insides into outsides, duh. I note blandly and get up, ignoring the stares on my back as I began walking out while the announcer went on and on and on about the heroics and sportsmanship displayed. It is as I leave the terrace that I am met with Minthara, who was currently busying herself beating the absolute shit out of some poor fatsod. Having fun? I ask as I approach. She turns to me with a dead look in her eyes. I need my ears cleansed. That bad, huh? I blink. The look she gave me did not give me much confidence in the survival of a number of people. Not that I wasn't going to twist the knife, that just wouldn't be sporting now, would it? Chapter 389, Chapter 9, of Guilds and Goblins. A few days had passed since the arena event, and oddly enough things had greatly calmed down. And while people were still attempting to curry favor and expose our vile plans with every opportunity they could get their grubby little hands on, which usually ended up with them publicly shamed by a sudden surge of rumors. The guilds were mostly reasonable at least, with the Fighters Guild quickly realizing that their presence would be useless at best. The current guildmaster decided to shove her head into the dirt and pretend like she didn't exist. People swiftly understood just how influential either I or Minthara were, even if no title was officially granted, and that same guildmaster had been trying to gouge prices and exploit the fact that a dragon apocalypse was happening. Quite frankly, I approved of her decision to hide herself, if for the momentary decision-making than anything else, as he was still quite thoroughly fucked in the end. The Fighters Guild was an organization primarily created to replace official armies in the culling of monsters and the protection of property for the lower classes. A partial privatization of the security sector, if you will, and the fact that they decided to even for a moment falter in their perceived and tradition-imposed duties for the sake of quick riches was going to be making issues down the line no matter what. I could already see it, militias forming, trust in both the government and guild falling drastically, people taking things into their own hands instead of paying professionals to do it and suffering the consequences of that same decision, etc., etc. Basically, the greedy cowards were making work for me, and that was unacceptable, so at least their leader is ending up defenestrated before I waddle over to Morrowind in a few weeks. If I could be bothered to do it anyway. The Synod was also being incredibly annoying recently, with constant requests for collaboration and poorly hidden attempts at enlightening our northern guests being spammed into my proverbial mailbox. Scorch huffed, having been forced to go through their increasingly asinine attempts to gain influence over me. If you could just No, Scorch, you are not the spam filter. Grumbling bird noises aside, I had the whole thing quickly investigated, and to my grand annoyance, it wasn't that the synod was largely incompetent, but that the representative they sent to the capital was quite frankly an attention-seeking special needs child who only became a mage because his father is one of the higher-ups in the whole organization. I could inform them of the dumb fuck's constant attempts to self-aggrandize while alienating a force of immense influence, but who was humble little I to stop them from digging a hole for themselves that would let me demand their loyalty and their liver to dig themselves out of. The College of Whispers were cooperative in word, but reticent in truth, their leader taking a more wait-and-see approach before she committed to anything beyond the most vague of trades. The merchants were far smarter than the rest of the lot combined. Barely any of them wanted to engage stupid politicking that did not have to do with competition between each other. All of the savvy cunts capable of surviving the market, jumping at the lucrative opportunities that suddenly appeared in Skyrim and Morrowind, with a downright ravenous hunger that left me wondering if I was dealing with merchants or vampires. I was downright surprised when nothing stupid happened when I called for a meeting with all of them, Titus having entrusted me to vet them as a renowned expert and commissioned consultant of the Empire. There was some shouting over each other, a near brawl between some of the more lively ones, and a few I had to throw out because they straight up weren't being serious about the whole thing, or were sent to sabotage the whole thing by some dumbasses I offended intentionally or not. In the end, a merchant company from Colovia got their hands on the Skyrim contract, a few of the others dipping into lesser roles and shares when allowed, while a company from Cheydinhall was going to be most of the Morrowind work when the time came, the border county having a somewhat peaceful relation with the Dunmer by sheer virtue of trading for centuries. And speaking of the Cheydinhall trader, the older man had just finished regaling me of his preliminary plans for the venture and was escorted out of my mansion. The city was one of the neutrals and mostly uncaring for the wider empire except when it came to taxes and going to war. A bit isolationist for my tastes, but I could work with it given enough time. Having nothing left to do in truth, I found myself skimming through the booklet the vampire gave me once more. It named a few officers in the Legion who had mostly been purged or forcefully retired as collaborators and a few prominent citizens as semi-ignorant assistants in the deed itself. It even named one of Titus's old counselors, but the man was already dead, choked on a bite of cheese if rumors were to be believed. I did not like how the mere mention of the specific food made me shiver in discomfort. Writing down orders for the death of all those still remaining, I reached the section that actually mattered. The final collaborators and even financiers of the deed were none other than the Counts of Leowin and Skingrad, the Thalmor fucks being unable to openly pay for the murder lest they be tracked down through the money flow. Now Leowin I could understand, the man was their bitch through and through. But Skingrad, something was off with that damn city and I needed information as soon as was reasonable. Still, I had a clue I could follow and time to kill, so I closed my eyes and began to focus my gaze south, the air sizzling with tension as the veritable torrent of magicka remained barely contained within my body. I could not get a clear image immediately, but a story slowly began to form before my proverbial eyes. The worshipper of a long-forbidden faith, the acts of the Aliad forever tainting the purity of that particular light, the bitterness of a devout young man, an offer from outside, the manipulations of the outsiders, the fall of the city's leadership under the devout man's grip, more and more depraved acts following after each other, and a blinding, uncompromising light watching over it all. By the end of the Vison, I was half scowling and half grinning, my eyes blazing with both hatred and excitement, the growl of a name leaving me unbidden, Meridia. Naturally, it was exactly then that a hand fell upon my shoulder and I barely held myself back from exploding the offending limb. Not that I could have done it quite as whimsically as I initially thought, as I realized who it belonged to. Minthara leaned in on my side, looking like she had just woken up from a nap. "What has you so distracted?" she asks as she presses her other hand into my second shoulder, giving a not very skillful impromptu massage. It was the intention that counted, I guess. Just found another reason to deal with Leowin as quickly as possible. I pause and add, them and Skingrad for that matter. "You said Skingrad would take time," she points out lightly. "Yeah." I nod, but I never said a thing about the two working together, so we could probably deal with issues of both cities separately before I fuck off north. I could hear the pout in her voice as she asked, "Do you really have to go?" Mephala has been badgering me with hints for days now. I groan lightly. I have no doubt her colleagues will not be too slow to follow. Also, more bodies to throw at the Thalmor is always good. Yes, yes. She rolls her eyes and scoots around to sit next to me and pretends to sniff dramatically. I'd give it a 6 out of 10. The smartass elf has everything planned already. I should just settle for smacking people into bits. The dry look I give her makes her look away with a light blush after only a moment's stare down, but before I could get in a quip or 15, a stray thought occurs and my eyes light up. Say Titus already gave you the rank he promised? Reserve-legged? Yes. She nods. Not as powerful as the real deal, but still influential enough to make some commands happen. I bet people bitched like mad when you were given such a high rank. I snort, having been busy coordinating the merchant meetup when Minthara was invited to a hunt, followed by a trip to Fort Legion. At first, she admits most of them simply felt I was not educated enough in command to hold the rank. They weren't against the promotion itself. Merely having your name attached to them is a point of prestige. I chuckle, not exaggerating one bit. As it should be. She lifts her nose and sniffs disdainfully. Also, they all shut up when I utterly trounced them in a war game we had organized. I stare at her for a long moment. You just personally broke their formation, didn't you? No, actually. She looks just a tiny bit smug. I won with tactics. Huh. I blink. Nice. Just nice? She pouts, but I can see the cheer in her eyes as I believe her without further questioning. Most neat indeed, my dear. I drawl and she huffs. Anyway, I may need you to go on a bit of a walk soon. And by soon, I mean tomorrow. What kind of walk? She turns somewhat serious. I began to lightly rub my palms as the time came for schemes most devious. How about you take whatever legionaries you can scrounge up, Roland and his boys, and your own followers, and head to that half-sunken goblin encampment by Water's Edge. The same Water's Edge north of Leowin. She raises an eyebrow, catching on almost immediately. That camp was reported to be rather large, so I doubt people will make too much of a mess about it. I hum along, and what with the, completely unrelated to me, rumors I have been hearing about the Fighters Guild's recent lack of reliability, I doubt people will make too much of a fuss about a military force being dispatched. And what will you be doing? She asks. I can convince Titus to let me go quite easily, but what is our actual goal? Jackal should be returning from Leowin within a day or so. I explain. When he does, I will personally infiltrate the city and uncover whatever sordid idiocy is happening within. The moment I do so, you will just happen to be leading the closest legionary detachment and barge into the city the moment you see something happening, or I contact you. That could work, she admits slowly, and I am guessing we can't just assault the city immediately because we lack visible justification. Just so, I nod. We are working in conditions a bit more complex than Skyrim, where one's word and reputation is enough. So yes, we will need an actual excuse to go in, even if we know they are traitors already. Irritating, but it makes sense. She grumbles along before looking up. Fine, I will have my people march in the morning. Gods know Roland will be eager at least. Man is exactly as eager about killing goblins as he should be. I nod in genuine approval. Your fixation with goblins is unhealthy, Minthara points out dryly. Me eyes narrow. That sounds like goblin apologist talk. She just rolls her eyes and yanks the both of us from our seats. That is enough brooding for today. Her eyes meet mine with a very familiar hunger glinting within. We have work to do tomorrow, and I am definitely not doing it without motivation. Now that I could agree on Chapter 390, Chapter X, of Militarism and Mercantilism. Titus, Maro, and Juculus all looked quite frustrated as I relayed the abbreviated version of Jackal's report to him, the blatant cooperation between Leowin and the Dominion being quite obvious if one took a moment's time to look into the situation on any deeper level. We were aware the South was slowly slipping into their grip, but this… Commander Maro shakes his head with a disgusted look on his face. My eyes narrow. You mean to tell me that you have no one in the city to gather such information? Either he was incompetent, or whoever protected the information of the city was actually worth a mention. Do not take me for a fool, Dagoth. The commander of the Penitus Oculatus doesn't quite growl, but it is a close thing. I have sent multiple agents only to have them disappear the moment they attempt to send a report home. Every single time. Considering the amount of manpower they need to keep the capital somewhat clean from enemy influence, I am not even going to shit on him for that one. And what of insiders? Same issue. His shoulders sag ever so slightly. Whoever they have guarding their interests is greatly skilled in subterfuge, and the Count still pays his taxes and keeps his books clean, so we can't just barge in without an actual excuse. Sending a full open investigation into the city would cause all manner of chaos, no doubt. Minthara interjects, already seeing the issue, which would then allow the Thalmor to cry and moan about it, and make other issues. And then there is the precedent of practically invading a city for everyone to see to worry about. Indeed, Titus nods. As you can see, our hands were quite tied for a long while now. Well, I do believe the situation needs unfucking post-haste. I steeple my fingers in thought. I have some 2 weeks before the relief train heads to Morrowind, and allowing Leowind's treachery and whatever is happening in Skingrad to continue would be, I grimace, annoying. An understatement if there ever was one. Titus notes dryly, your expression tells me you already have a plan. A most cunning plan indeed. I lean in and begin explaining what Minthara and I agreed on last night. Maro's expression growing more and more incredulous with each word. Allow me to simplify this. The poor commander voices tiredly, you wish to infiltrate an immensely dangerous city, gather evidence on your lonesome, and then use said evidence to occupy the city with a band of adventurers and glory seekers, and worst of all the forces of another count who just happened to be nearby, and find out whatever the golden bitch is doing and promptly ruin her day. I raise a finger, can't forget that part. Yes, his professionalism cracks and he audibly sighs. How could I forget the part where you told me you wished to provoke a Daedra? Knowing how these things usually go, I have no doubts she is involved in the betrayal in some way. I shrug, much to the poor man's growing headache. The ban of her worship in the Heartlands has been in place ever since Alessia's empire. Any chance to regain an influence here she would take. And to annoy me, of course, but they did not need to know that. All fair points, Titus allows, and yet I find myself feeling quite dubious about having you infiltrate the city alone. Need I remind you I am both Archmage and a champion of some skill? I quirk an eyebrow, and he, after a few moments of consideration, makes a shallow nod. Besides, I add, who said I would be alone? Greetings, meatbags. Akulakan's voice rings out from the corner of the room, making Juculus jump up in fright while the two Imperials reached for their swords on instinct. I do believe you were informed of my brainchild in Junior's reports, no? I ask, just a bit smugly, as the trio glare at me and Minthara shakes her head in amused exasperation. Yes. Titus slowly removes his hand from what is obviously Goldbrand. Your prowess in the lost arts of the Dwemer has been marked as notable, but this... My master's artifice is beyond compare. Akulakan states the fact, be in awe, meatbags, for you have been permitted a glance at perfection. Titus raises an eyebrow as if to say, awfully sure of yourself, aren't you? But does not voice it, and instead turns back to me, and you are certain you will not be putting yourself and our plans, which was the more important part, obviously, in danger. Worst case scenario, I just escape. I shrug, but I sincerely doubt it will come to that. The Emperor of Tamriel sighs and twitches a signal for his Chancellor, who swiftly brings a bottle from a nearby shelf and pours him a drink. I am getting too old for this. Titus laments and downs the whole thing. I can feel your life force, old man. I grin at him and his hand stills. That cozy retirement will have to wait a while longer. Tisk. As much as I wanted to, I wasn't going to be heading out for a while longer. Annoying as the fact was, it would take Minthara, who had already left through the southern gate of the city under official orders by the Emperor himself, about 2 days to go and actually do her work, which meant I had at least a day before I had to head out. Going too early would be wasting time after all, and it was better not to give too much warning to whatever Thalmor observer was assigned to watch over their investment. Now one might find themselves wondering, why not simply flood the city with agents and have them gather all the proof Titus needs? 3 reasons. 1. The city was protected to the point I would have to sacrifice multiple agents of impressive skill to get what I needed. 2. Meridia was there and she'd no doubt add to the casualties. 3, and most important of all, I wanted to give the golden bitch the finger, and infiltrating a city seemed fun. Jackal and his Mephalans would serve me far better by uncovering the apparent clusterfuck of civil unrest going on in Skingrad. The man hypothesized some kind of populist rebellion, or one orchestrated to look as such, but we were still somewhat reticent to just throw people at our problems, so the infiltration would still take some time. That I could feel very little from the city itself made me cautious to the point of mild paranoia. My scheming was interrupted as I heard my 2 subjects knock my study's door, enter. Idrasa and Eldor shuffle in and take their seats. "Have you managed it?" I ask. "We have." Idrasa nods, mild annoyance tinging her tone. The merchant who agreed to the meeting previously attempted to gouge the price once he realized we worked for you, but a few implied threats shut him up. "Dumbass." Eldor rolls his eyes. Not incorrect. We would do no business with someone so blatantly avaricious. His lack of wisdom is his own problem, so long as it has no negative impact on our work. I point out lazily, "How soon can you begin work?" "Within 3 days. Eldor, being the more mercantile of the 2, answers, "It will take some time to move the product and spread rumors among the high spenders, so opening it any sooner would be unwise. I have also contracted the town criers to spread the news throughout the city. They charged a premium, but their reputation seems to be worth the price." "Acceptable," I hum. "My lord." Idrasa begins hesitantly, "Is it truly, wise to sell our automatons to the Heartlanders?" "A fair question," I raise an eyebrow. "You feel my decision is wrong?" She stills for a moment, her deep-seated fear paralyzing her for a moment, before she remembered we were long beyond such things, and relaxed somewhat. "Is it not risky to spread them so widely? A lot of our power comes from the monopoly on the automatons, even if that is somewhat diluted by selling so many to Skyrim." "Your concerns would be valid," I allow patiently, "if not for the fact that our power does not hinge on said monopoly. While the Heartlanders may manage to copy the lesser designs I have chosen to be sold, it would take them decades at the very least before they could begin production on any scale even close to rivaling our own." I take a drag of my cigar and go on, and that is without mentioning the fact their quality would obviously be subpar at best and barely functioning at worst. I am the greatest enchanter on Nirn as of right now, and am technically considered a tonal architect. To even imply that some swit from the Synod would be able to copy me would be hilariously funny if it were not so damn personally insulting. She bows her head. "Apologies." "No need to fret over it." I wave her off. Caution is all well and good, but at this point competition will just make us look better in comparison. That and having an active role in the economy will make those who buy our unique product far more amicable to our desires. Eldor adds while rubbing his hands, "The poor fools will thank you for the convenience and happily sing off their loyalty so that they can get more. Which is why I have held back from selling military-grade animunculi." I nod at him approvingly. Limited access to such loyal warriors will be both a sign of prestige and influence, and will in turn bring us both. I swear the damn goblin had septim marks in his eyes for a moment. Feeling just about ready to dismiss the duo back to their duties, I suddenly remembered something, and my eyes met Idrasa's. "Have you finished compiling the Forge blueprint?" I may or may not have forgotten about it in the recent excitement. Finally, her empty expression shows some excitement as she straightens up. "I have compiled all of the separate parts, but the full construction will take me a few more weeks to perfect." "Focus on that," I command easily. Eldor is obviously more interested in running the merchant branch, and motivation is half the work. Most people in her position would have considered this to be a form of demotion, but I have long since tempered such idiocy out of my servants, and she understood that she was not losing her position or influence just because there was someone better at a particular job. Her skill at Dwemetech was of a respectable expert level already, and demanding a new path from her would have been quite disingenuous, seeing as I did put her on her current one myself. It was still a missed opportunity, obviously, but not to the point of causing any consequential stress or tension. Eldor did look like he had just won the lottery and found a lucrative investment opportunity at the same time, which wasn't wrong if one squinted real hard. I needed more Falmer in high positions anyway. What with me being their de facto king and all they needed the representation, even if I was effectively running an autocracy. An enlightened one, yes, but I wasn't quite so cheeky as to call myself anything beside a dictator. Finally dismissing the two, I cracked open the Aldmary book on spirituality I got close to a year ago and began to read, my right hand snaking out to my quill and writing down notes for a plan so much more cunning than a mere infiltration.